Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Chris, are you guys hearing this on your end?
Yes, coming through loud and clear.
All right, we'll probably be starting in just a moment.
Subcommittee will come to order. So I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Would note that we are expecting votes today, first votes between 11 and 11:30. We will be continuing the hearing during the votes and have people sit in as chair as necessary so that people can vote from the committee room, get into the floor and back. For members participating remotely, I want to remind you of key regulations from the House Committee on Rules. Members must be visible on video to be considered in attendance and to participate unless experiencing connectivity issues. Members must also continue to use the video function for the remainder of the time they are attending this meeting and hearing unless experiencing connectivity issues or other tech problems. If a member is experiencing any connectivity issue or other technical problems, please inform committee staff as soon as possible so that you can receive assistance. A chat function is available for members on the Cisco WebEx platform for this purpose. Members can also call the committee's main line 202-225-4472 for technical assistance by phone. Members may not participate in any more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. However, for security reasons, members may maintain a connection to the software platform while not in attendance. It is the responsibility of each member seeking recognition to unmute their microphone prior to speaking and to keep their microphone muted when not speaking to avoid inadvertent background noise. Let me repeat that last phrase. It is your responsibility to keep your microphone muted when not speaking to avoid inadvertent background noise. As the chair of today's meeting and hearing, I'll make a good faith effort to provide every member experiencing connectivity issues an opportunity to participate fully in proceedings. And finally, to insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentstni@mail.house.gov. I'll now start with my opening statement. I would ask unanimous consent my opening statement be entered into the record in full. That objection so ordered. Because of our votes coming up, I will just give you a truncated version of my opening statement and move to a few of the things I want to hear from our hearing witnesses today. First, following the 2014 Ebola virus outbreak, the GAO recommended the Department of Transportation work with relevant federal agencies to develop a aviation preparedness plan for communicable disease crises. Although these agencies did not dispute the GAO's recommendation, they took no significant action to develop a preparedness plan. So for Ms. Kraus at the GAO, I look forward to hearing about the benefits of a national aviation preparedness plan and GAO's other recommendations to improve the safety of the traveling public and to minimize disruptions to the national aviation system. Moreover, COVID-19 pandemic has created fragmented travel requirements, resulting in a confusing system for passengers, U.S. airlines, and flight crews to navigate. These challenges range from various acceptable test results to inconsistent quarantine periods. To address these issues, digital vaccine and testing passports are gaining popularity, and recently, major carriers such as United and American launched mobile apps which can enable passengers to show immunization records and recent testing results when traveling abroad. So, Mr. Callio from A4A, I'm interested in learning more about what U.S. carriers' efforts are to develop these passports and what standards are necessary to scale up deployment if necessary. And further, I often say that the public health response will lead economic recovery. And since last December, the Food and Drug Administration has issued EUAs for 3 COVID-19 vaccinations. The President has recently pledged to make nearly 600 million doses available by the end of July. So as we think about vaccine distribution and administration across the country, frontline aviation workers must be appropriately considered for access. So Captain DePete from ALPA, I look forward to hearing more about the essential role of airline pilots in U.S. aviation's recovery and how improving access to vaccinations is critical to ensuring the safety of flight crews. And as the U.S. aviation industry embarks on a flight path to recovery, the nation needs a bold, FDR-like investment in infrastructure to drive local economies, to create jobs, and to fight climate change, something I think the full committee will be taking up very soon. So I'm pleased that Mr. Lance Little, from the Managing Director of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport in my home state of Washington, is here today on the panel on behalf of AAAE. And I look forward to hearing more about the importance of federal investment in airports' growing infrastructure needs and efforts to improve environmental sustainability. Also looking forward, the U.S. aviation system is undergoing a historic shift with the continued growth of unmanned aircraft and the emergence of new airspace entrants such as advanced air mobility. So while collaboration between the federal government, the industry, and other stakeholders is ongoing, the safe integration of new entrants is far from complete. And I know that Mr. Bunce from GAMA has comments in his written statement about these issues, and I'd like to hear more from him about Congress's role to establish a comprehensive policy framework and investment necessary to foster innovation in the U.S. airspace as we look forward to recovery. But a recovery is only possible with continued federal support from the hardworking women and men of the aviation workforce and the next generation of engineers, pilots, mechanics, and technicians. So Mr. Bolin from NBAA, I look forward to hearing more from you about ways to improve access to STEM-based apprenticeships, skills training, and career and tech education programs to diversify and grow the U.S. aviation pipeline. Comments I know that you have included in your statement. So I'll conclude there, just to say the American people are sacrificing greatly to combat COVID-19. We recognize that. They are counting on us in Congress to do our part to keep people safe, to get the country to the other side of this pandemic. And I'm confident that with Congress's continued support, the U.S. aviation industry and workforce will be able to move toward long-term economic recovery. So I want to say thank you to today's witnesses and turn to Mr. Representative Garrett Graves of Louisiana for opening comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. I appreciate the opportunity to have this hearing today. This pandemic has been extraordinary in terms of the impacts to everyday Americans, everything from mental health challenges, increase in suicides, increase in opioid dependence, lost jobs, loss in economic activity, of course, folks in nursing homes unable to have their loved ones come visit, causing mental health as well as physical health problems. Good news, as the chairman noted, is that 130 million vaccines have already been prepared and available for Americans as of the end of this month, and we're on track right now to have all Americans access to vaccines by the summer, which is great news. Mr. Chairman, as you well know, back in April of last year, passenger flights were down 95%, year over year, looking at 19 to 20. Flights were down 60%. It's estimated that somewhere between $1.6 and $1.8 trillion and additional savings were realized as a result of the extraordinary drop in economic activity and in flights. Congress has stepped up and twice now provided the passenger support program. I just said that. The payroll support program, supporting passengers, because what is important is that we actually have the bandwidth, we have the capacity of our airline industry, of the ability to have business and recreational travel, tourism travel available for when the economy picks back up again. And so those investments have gone to help ensure that we have that bandwidth, we have the capacity. We've also made investments in airports to ensure that the infrastructure is there, is ready to go. And I'm going to say it again, this is absolutely integral to our economic recovery. Now, something else that we need to be thinking about and considering much, and I'm interested to hear from some of the witnesses on this, is the fact that since airline passenger flights and travel has been down significantly, are we ready in terms of a safety perspective, the equipment that has been in storage or mothballed, the pilots that aren't getting the number of hours that they normally get, the other airline support workers, flight attendants and others, are we ready to go and to do it safely and to ramp back up quickly to 100% capacity? As the chairman noted, we don't need to just get back to where we were before. We have had extraordinary challenges in the aviation industry with some of the safety issues associated with 737 MAX, as well as all the statistics I just covered, including the 95% reduction in flights dating back to April of last year. But we have some amazing opportunities on the horizon and within the aviation industry, and of course, one of the biggest being unmanned systems and integration into our airspace. So looking forward to hearing the witnesses' testimony, and I just want to again reiterate what the chairman said in regard to helping us to think forward and project some of the needs out of this body to ensure that we're ready to go from a capacity and a safety perspective whenever the economy fully opens back up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Representative Graves. Representative Fazio, recognized for opening statement.
I thank the gentleman. You know, it seems like we've been here before about once every 10 years. You know, we had the Gulf War. We saw the failures of Pan Am and Eastern and bankruptcy filings, lost a lot of jobs. 9/11, terror attacks. You know, we had bankruptcies of numerous airlines and a loss of a lot of jobs, and a lot of people lost their pensions and everything else. You know, but this time is a little different. Congress rose to the occasion, and we created what I think is the most successful part of the CARES Act or anything we've done during the pandemic to support working Americans, the payroll support program. Totally scandal-free. Unlike the Paycheck Protection Program, where some major chains and others scammed the system, and other problems with that. Not a penny went to the airlines. There were restrictions on executive pay, bonuses, stock buybacks, dividends, and we have saved, in the aggregate, I would say, you know, tens of thousands or up to 100,000 jobs, including contractors and that, and kept people in their homes, kept their health insurance and other benefits. To be ready for the return of the aviation industry, which is beginning to look better and better. Last April, there were 3 million passenger boardings in the month. November, we were up to almost 30 million. And, you know, I'm hopeful when this current program, which is included in this COVID package pending over in the dysfunctional Senate with stupid rules written by senators who've been dead for 10 years, but a PSP is not challenged under the dead guy rule, so hopefully it will go through as written. You know, and I'm hoping by September 30th we are not going to need another extension. You know, there's ongoing concerns. We do not have comprehensive long-term plans in place. You know, there was first proposed back by GAO to the Obama administration to come up with comprehensive plans for modes of transportation. They didn't. 4 years, the Trump administration didn't. I numerous times asked the FAA administrator to impose a mask mandate, and he refused, saying, oh, he couldn't do that. So we left it up to the airlines, who did come through. But it's one thing to have the airline say, this is our rule, and it's another thing to have the announcement at the beginning, which are getting better. The first, these need to be emphatic, particularly the jerks who get on and suck on a lollipop or sip a bottle of water for 6 hours. They need to hear that you can remove your mask briefly for food or drink or to take a medication. They need to hear about the fines that will be imposed if they don't follow the mask rule. They need to hear about being banned from flights by the airlines, which a number of the airlines took their own initiative to do. But we have to be emphatic. And the chair and I introduced a comprehensive bill last time, Healthy Flights Act of 2020. We will be informed by this hearing on potential changes to that legislation, and I still think we need to put those strictures in place because the FAA doesn't seem to take much initiative. And I've also been working with Chair Thompson to get TSA to strictly enforce the mask rule at the checkpoint. That's the best place, much better than getting to the gate and having the gate agents having to deal with unruly people. They still haven't gone as far as I want, which is to have posters that show people what they can and can't wear. We have to inform people that a lot of things people are using routinely are not allowed on airplanes. You can't have just a gaiter, a single layer, or you can't have a kerchief, and you have to actually cover your nose and mouth, which a lot of people don't seem quite to get. And we don't want to move too quickly as we recover to remove these precautions, and we want to know that long-term we have a strategy to keep people safe when they fly during hopefully the end of this pandemic, and in future pandemics. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chair DeFazio. Before we go to witnesses, I just want to make one acknowledgement today. I want to acknowledge my senior legislative aide, Alexandra Minardi. Today is Alex's last aviation subcommittee hearing as a member of my personal staff. She's not going far. She's actually going to the professional staff for this subcommittee. So so I want to thank Chair DeFazio for his wisdom in hiring her, and also I will send him the bill. Alex, though, has been a valued member of my staff for nearly 4 years on aviation policy, on energy policy, tribal and environmental policy in the Pacific Northwest. So I want to thank Alex for her hard work and dedication, and she'll do a great job here at the subcommittee. With that, let's move to the witnesses, and to save time rather than to run through introductions with titles, we'll just go one at a time. I think folks have the information about the individual witnesses. And we are going to start with Ms. Heather Kraus from the GAO. So Ms. Kraus, you are recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss our ongoing work on the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the aviation industry. International flight restrictions, local stay-at-home orders, and a general fear of contracting and spreading COVID-19 through air travel had a sudden and profound effect on all aspects of the aviation industry. According to the Department of Transportation statistics, as was noted, passenger traffic was down 60% system-wide in 2020 compared to traffic levels in 2019. The ripple effect from this unprecedented and sustained reduction in demand has affected airlines, industry-wide employment, and the entire aviation supply chain. Congress and the administration have taken a number of actions to help the nation's aviation industry respond to and recover from the economic effects of the pandemic, most notably providing over $100 billion in economic relief to aviation businesses. In return, recipients were required to generally maintain their employment levels, among other requirements. My testimony today is based on our continued work overseeing CARES Act and other funds to the aviation industry and the industry's response to the pandemic. It focuses on 3 areas. One, actions that businesses across the aviation industry have taken to respond to reduced passenger demand. Two, factors that may affect industry recovery. And three, considerations for any federal actions. First, in response to reduced passenger demand, aviation businesses quickly built their cash reserves to weather the downturn and implemented measures to reduce their costs. These actions included leveraging federal assistance, raising money in the private markets, and reducing labor, operating, and capital expenditures. For example, airlines, airports, and others leveraged federal assistance provided in 2 federal coronavirus relief laws to support payroll and other expenses. In addition, industry associations and credit rating agencies said that federal assistance increased confidence in the aviation industry, enabling aviation businesses to raise money in private debt and equity markets to strengthen their cash reserves. Even with these and other actions, the U.S. aviation outlook remains uncertain. The industry's eventual recovery to pre-pandemic passenger levels is highly dependent on factors outside the industry's control. According to several industry forecasts, public health factors affecting the recovery include the success of COVID-19 vaccinations, the spread and impact of potential COVID variants, and public confidence in the safety of air travel, among others. In addition, recovery in some aviation sectors will depend on how the airline industry responds to the financial pressures and changes in demand associated with these uncertainties. For example, one aviation manufacturer we spoke with said airlines are likely to continue to postpone the delivery and purchases of long-haul aircraft over the next few years to better align with passenger demands. In turn, this would affect demand for aviation manufacturing and aircraft maintenance services. While many are optimistic for a post-pandemic economic recovery, the speed and degree to which the aviation industry will be able to rebound is likely to vary across different sectors. For example, credit rating agencies told us that low-cost, leisure-oriented airlines are likely to recover faster than network airlines that are more dependent on business and international travel. As we enter the second year of the pandemic and the pace and duration of the recovery becomes clearer, Congress may contemplate additional actions to support the industry's recovery. GAO has identified 3 fundamental principles that can serve as a framework for considering future assistance. They include 1, identifying and defining the problem, 2, determining the national interests and setting clear goals and objectives that address the problem, and 3, protecting the government's interests. In applying these principles, some issues emerge that may help inform how best to design any response. For example, when addressing the longer-term public health implications of the pandemic, the federal government plays an important role in working with the industry to mitigate the effects of the pandemic and understand how various technologies and processes could help protect the health of air travelers. In addition, the entire aviation industry could benefit from the development of a national aviation preparedness plan for communicable diseases, a recommendation, as it was mentioned, we made to DOT in 2015 and have since urged Congress to require DOT to develop such a plan. In closing, the challenges facing the aviation sector are unprecedented and many uncertainties remain as to the pace and extent of recovery. We will continue to support Congress in understanding and addressing these pressing issues. This concludes my statement. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kraus, and I want to commend you for taking 5 minutes and only 5 minutes to set a great example for not just the panel, but for members of Congress. So thank you very much. Next up, Nick Callio with Airlines for America. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Graves and Chairman DeFazio. I would like to start by acknowledging everything that this committee, led by the chairman, the 2 chairmen, and the ranking members have done for the aviation industry and the airline industry over the last year. You have been great partners, and we are forever in your debt. It's a model of the way things should work when help is needed. Right now, the state of the industry, it's been referenced, a year ago, we were in the golden age of flying. We're flying 58,000 tons of cargo and 2.5 million passengers a day. The bottom fell out very, very quickly. In April of last year, Chairman Larson pointed out, we were flying about 5% of the people that we had the year before, and domestic is doing better than international. Right now, we are still down significantly. We're flying about 40% of the passengers that we used to. We were hoping that it would be better by now, but it hasn't. We've learned that you can forecast with this virus, but you can plan with this virus, but you can't forecast very well. Currently, we're flying 50% fewer flights, which I'm sure you've noticed, than we were a year ago. Booked revenue is down 80%. And most critically, we are still losing $150 million a day. That's a lot better than it was at points last year, but that is not sustainable as a business model. We had hoped by now we would break even. We're hopeful that by the end of the year, we will break even. That's going to depend on the cooperation of the virus, the vaccines, and many other factors. In the meantime, the PSP has been a lifeline to the industry. When it first happened last March, it gave us the ability to go to private markets, even though the money was passing through directly to our employees. And I agree with Chairman DeFazio. The PSP is the single most successful part of the CARES Act. The money has gone directly to employees to keep them on the payroll. By keeping them on the payroll, they continue to pay taxes. They're not in the unemployment lines. They continue to spend money. And most critically for our industry, they're ready to get back on the planes and fly when they can. And that is important in our industry because of the training and certification requirements that are constantly ongoing in terms of how you can get on an airplane and be able to fly and protect the public. Throughout this pandemic, we have worked hand in glove with our employees and with our labor partners. It's been a very good match working with all of you to get this done. It hasn't been easy. We are very grateful that the House has moved to extend the payroll support program again. Things could look very different than they do now. It's not going to be a miracle cube, but they could look different come September 30th. So we hope that the Senate will pass that bill quickly. We saw last October what happens when you dawdle. Tens of thousands of people can lose their jobs. The other thing is throughout this, and in terms of Chairman Larson, your bill, and Chairman DeFazio, your bill is about airline preparedness. The changes that the airlines have made are going to stay in place forever. We took a lot of self-help measures early to protect ourselves. We cut executive compensation even before the CARES Act was passed. We went to the private market. As the GAO has pointed out, we were able to raise over $70 billion. We suspended capital return programs and unfortunately had to suspend a lot of capital investment programs. We sold or retired aircraft earlier than was expected, and we'd worked with our employees in terms of voluntary paid leave and early retirements. It kept the industry online. We are still struggling, however, and in dire straits. Throughout this, when you talk about measures that are going to stay in place, we leaned into the science very heavy. All of our member carriers hooked up with one clinic or another or one university or another. We put in place enhanced cleaning and disinfection procedures. We imposed the face mask requirement, and we're glad that the government now backs that up. We required health declarations before you get on the airplane. We made announcements we enforced, and a lot of people are not flying our airlines now because they wouldn't comply with the requirements. Most importantly, we tried to educate the public about the air filtration systems on aircraft, which give you hospital-grade air and make it safer to fly, to be on an airplane than it is to be in a grocery store, a bar, a restaurant, or in your own home, actually. And I would just want to say a word about that. US Transcom did a study about people seated next to each other and the risk of transmission if you were wearing a face mask given the air filtration system. 0.003% risk of transmission. We thought what we were doing was good, but we knew if we said it, it wouldn't be credible. So with some other aviation stakeholders, we engaged the Harvard School of Public Health. We told them they had free reign. They gave us some recommendations. They were independent. They gave us some recommendations, which are now in place in terms of air filtration during boarding and deplaning and boarding and deplaning procedures.
Mr. Kelly, I have to ask you to wrap.
Okay, in wrapping it up, I just want to say thank you again to this committee. Chairman DeFazio, I just want to, on a personal note, and this is a compliment, you have worked like a farm animal throughout this pandemic, plowing through on behalf of the industry, and we're grateful to you, Chairman Larson, the ranking members, and this entire committee. Thank you very much.
What kind of farm animal? We'll get to that later.
It's
A good friendly one, Peter.
a good friendly one. I think it's just best to take the compliment and we'll move to the next, next panelist. Captain Joe DePete with ALPA. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, and the members of the subcommittee. Captain Joe DePete, President of the Airline Pilots Association International, which represents more than 59,000 pilots and is the world's largest airline pilot union and non-governmental aviation safety organization. Since the pandemic began, airline pilots have been on the front lines of the fight against COVID-19. We've kept supply chains flowing and the global economy connected. We've transported medical personnel, PPE, and life-saving vaccines, and we've worked to ensure that aviation can fulfill its critical role in the nation's economic recovery once the pandemic and public health crisis is behind us. ALPA pilots have not allowed the pandemic to distract us from what is always our highest priority, and that is safety. For years, ALPA pilots have advocated a data-driven, risk-based approach to safety. During COVID-19, pilots have instituted a proactive safety culture on every flight. We gathered data to identify the effects of the pandemic and inform decision makers how to protect the traveling public. Backed by the data, ALPA was among the first to call for uniform, mandatory guidelines for cleaning and disinfecting aircraft, employee exposure notification, and the use of face masks. We appreciate this subcommittee's support of these measures, and we're pleased that the Biden administration has mandated masks for public transportation, something that should have been done a long, long time ago. In addition, ALPA has called for airline pilots to receive priority access to vaccines to ensure that they continue to support the public health response and economic recovery. Flight crews are already deemed essential workers by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and they should be deemed essential workers regarding vaccine prioritization as well. Internationally, some countries have established COVID-19 policies that have disturbing consequences for U.S. pilots. ALPA urges our government to ensure that U.S. citizens can be safely evacuated from any location if necessary, and that we preserve the dignity of work by ensuring U.S. pilots are not subjected to unacceptable conditions related to the pandemic. Research shows that a layered public health precaution have created very low risks of virus transmission on airplanes. Despite this evidence, the number of U.S. passenger flights is currently down 50% from pre-pandemic levels. DCA, for example, has experienced a 67% decline in scheduled passenger flights from 2 years ago. Similar drop-offs across the country have resulted in shuttered airlines and aviation worker layoffs. 3 ALPA carriers, Trans-States Airlines, Compass Airlines, and ExpressJet, have ceased operations and their pilots are now jobless. Because airlines may seek reorganization, Congress must reform the broken Chapter 11 process to protect collective bargaining agreements. And in the meantime, our pilots have stepped up to weather this storm by negotiating more than 100 agreements with our airlines to help stabilize our companies and fuel the recovery. The COVID-19 crisis is unprecedented in its speed, magnitude, and duration. By passing the CARES Act payroll support program, Congress kept tens of thousands of aviation workers on the payroll and connected to healthcare. ALPA pilots are indebted to Chairman DeFazio and Chairman Larson and others for developing and extending the PSP. And while the PSP has been a historic success, our industry remains in a precarious position. Many ALPA members and other aviation workers have received notices of furlough as soon as March 31st. Putting furloughed pilots back on the flight deck isn't as simple as flipping a switch. Airline pilots are subject to training requirements and medical certifications that take time to requalify. Keeping a strong U.S. pilot workforce is critical to our recovery. Recently, the importance of a strong pilot workforce and our nation having 2 qualified, trained, and experienced pilots on board its airliners became clear once again when a United flight crew made a safe emergency landing following an engine failure on a flight from Denver to Honolulu. With the hopeful trends in virus containment and vaccine rollout, and our collective work to position the pilot workforce and the airline industry for a successful rebound, we are cautiously optimistic about recovery. With continued leadership from Congress, we can make certain that the United States and its passengers and cargo shippers can count on a strong pilot workforce now and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Pete. I want to recognize now Mr. Peter Bunce. You're recognized for 5 minutes. I see. Mr. Bunce, you need to unmute yourself.
Chair Larson, Ranking Member Graves, Chair DeFazio, thank you for letting me be with you today. We have talked previously about the aviation industry being one large ecosystem, and all working together, we can solve problems for the entire industry. The fortunes of what happens on the commercial side impacts those in business and general aviation greatly, especially our very fragile and interconnected supply chain. When we were all together a year ago, we couldn't have anticipated that some of our manufacturing facilities would be shuttered for over a month as we worked on the local restrictions. And when we were able to bring workers back, we had to pivot like we read about they did in World War II, like the auto industry pivoted to making aircraft. We pivoted to making PPE gear, ventilator equipment, things like that, because basically the supply chain was so disrupted that we didn't have the parts and pieces that we needed to either fix aircraft on the maintenance side of the house or build new ones. So what did that translate to? That was, according to our sister manufacturing association, about 110,000 member job loss in this very highly skilled workforce that I know Ms. Krause and some of the work that was done with the GAO recognized how unique our aerospace workforce is and how we cannot have these workers leave to other industries because of their very specific skill set. How it affected us in business and general aviation is every one of our aircraft segments were down last year. We just reported on the numbers last week. Whether it's piston, turboprop, jet airplanes, or on the rotorcraft side, piston and turbine and rotorcraft, everyone was down, and that translated to about a $5 billion decrease in revenue and billings during 2020. And during this whole time, the health and safety of our workers within our factory and those in our supply chain have been first and foremost. So we've had a lot of innovative workforce actions within our factories that we've been able to bring back some production to be able to separate workers, put them on teams, spread out the shifts, and be able to have them work safely at their workstations together. When we look at what the government can do to help our industry, there are several things. And the first I'd like to start with to compliment Chair Larson and the work that he has done with Representative Estes in being able to advocate for this 50-50 cost share, to be able to help us bring back some of those workers or not continue to lay off other workers, and have this cost share partnership translate to being able to make sure that those workers do not filter over time into some other industry and bring them off of unemployment so they have the health care that we offer. So we're in strong support, and we thank this committee very much in the House for passing that, and we hope that the Senate does as well as part of reconciliation. On the level of federal agencies, we're very complimentary of what the FAA has done with video inspections and different workarounds that have happened during the pandemic that have actually allowed us to keep business functioning. But we do need the DOT to help us by allowing the FAA to have some of the regulatory roadblocks and backlog that filtered up to DOT during the last administration now get pushed back down to where the expertise lies within the FAA to be able to allow us to have the regulations to be able to build product. Versus other industries, we have to have regulations to be able to do things in aviation because of just the safety concerns that are involved. So that would be a tremendous help to us. In addition, the national interest exception is a program that is administered by the federal government. We've asked the FAA, and they've been very helpful with us to be able to get all of the desperate views that the State Department takes at different embassies around to allow foreign nationals to come to the U.S. and train. We know we do the best pilot training in the world, also maintenance training in the world. We need to facilitate them coming here to get that training, but also to accept new production aircraft that we put out. And in the sustainability arena, we've got great efforts going on with sustainable aviation fuel. Congress can help us out with or a blending credit that supplements the biodiesel tax credit. And now we could talk about that later. And then Chair Larson, you were talking about this new area of aviation that I think is just as exciting as the dawn of the jet age must have been in urban air mobility. And we're very complimentary of what Representative Davids has done along with Ranking Member Graves to be able to push this new legislation forward, which will coalesce federal agencies. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bunce. Appreciate that. And now turn to Mr. Lance Little. You're recognized for 5 minutes, and we'll note you're speaking on behalf of the American Association of Airport Executives. Lance?
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Larson, Chair DeFazio, Ranking Members Sam Graves and Garrett Graves, and subcommittee members for the opportunity to testify today. While my testimony today highlights the unprecedented hardship that aviation continues to face during the pandemic, I am proud of the incredible efforts undertaken by our industry to keep passengers and workers safe and healthy and to restore traveler confidence. Clearly, the passenger and revenue declines have been historic at airports of all sizes nationwide. Revenues and PFC collections are already off by more than $20 billion, with tens of billions in additional losses projected. At the same time, airport fixed costs remain, and the pandemic has required investments to enhance public health. In response, SCA and other airports have taken steps to cut costs where possible. This includes pay freezes, hiring freezes, and project deferrals. However, the levers that can be pulled are relatively limited. That's where CARES and the other federal assistance have been critical. I can honestly say that we would not have been able to continue our operations and serve our customers without that significant and timely federal support. Businesses at airports have been significantly impacted, and SCA has taken decisive actions to help. We have deferred rent and fees, renegotiated leases, and accelerated payments to airlines to help with cash flow. We're grateful that Congress has provided critical direct airport concessions relief. I remain incredibly optimistic about our future and believe airports will emerge even stronger and more resilient than before, thanks to the help that this subcommittee and Congress has provided over the past year. Over the last year, airports have taken meaningful steps to enhance public health. A new Harvard study found that the probability of being infected at an airport is very low because of the consistent and impressive commitments airports have made to reduce the risk of transmission. At SCA, we have increased cleaning, added hand sanitizer stations, floor decals and signs. We have invested in innovative technologies for touchless travel, installed protective barriers, and contracted for traveler testing services. We also mandated mask wearing airport-wide since last spring. Our goal at SCA is to prepare for and accommodate our passengers with 21st century customer service. This includes improved facilities and new technologies to enhance airport experience. We're also committed to continuously enhance health protocols. Further investigation about the widespread use of health passport is worth additional discussion as well. We deeply appreciate House passage of the American Rescue Plan, including additional relief for airports, airlines, and airport concessionaires. Moving forward, let me highlight a few additional areas where we hope to partner with you. First, coordinate with us to prepare for and respond to public health emergencies, such as through the National Aviation Preparedness Plan Act, Second, resist new travel restrictions or domestic testing requirements, which we believe are unworkable and would impact the industry's ability to recover. Third, restore customer confidence in air travel, which includes communicating broadly about our efforts to keep travelers healthy. Fourth, maximize the positive impacts of aviation industry, such as scaling sustainable aviation fuels, supporting small and diverse businesses, increasing workforce development, and continued noise mitigation efforts. Finally, I urge Congress to pass a comprehensive infrastructure bill. It may seem strange for me to talk about upgrading and expanding airports after a 60% passenger decline, but when passenger levels inevitably return, we want to be ready to accommodate them, especially if upgraded facilities designed for touchless technologies and additional room for social distancing continues to be required. Specifically, Congress should provide a path to sustainable airport investment through a long overdue adjustment to the federal cap on local PSCs. Members of the subcommittee, we're in the midst of challenging times, but with your continued support, I believe we can emerge even stronger than before. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Little. And before I introduce Mr. Ed Bolin, I just would note, without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record today. So without objection. So I now recognize Mr. Ed Bolin for 5 minutes. Mr. Bolin.
Well, thank you, Chairman Larson. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today representing the National Business Aviation Association. As everyone on this committee knows, business aviation is the use of general aviation aircraft for business purposes. In the United States, thousands of companies rely on business aviation to get products and people where they need to be, when they need to be there. Business aviation is an industry that generates an enormous amount of jobs and economic development. It is an industry that helps foster productivity and efficiency. It also flies humanitarian flights. And during the COVID crisis, we have flown an enormous amount of personal protective equipment and COVID tests. 2020 has been an epically challenging year for our industry. At times, business aviation flights were down as much as 75%. Even today, at Teterboro, a gateway airport for New York, flights are down 50%. But oftentimes, when things are at the worst, we have an opportunity to demonstrate our best. And I think that ecosystem, that aviation ecosystem that my colleague Pete Bunce talked about, has been on full display during the COVID crisis. Congress's prompt action with the CARES Act was essential in providing critical help to our industry. Your investments allowed us to retain pilots, technicians, and other professionals in the aviation industry. You helped us find ways to come together and operate safely in a rugged environment that at times included ATC 0 operations. In short, we've come together to find our way forward, consistent with our value of safety. We're determined to not just survive this crisis, but to emerge stronger. On-demand air mobility, the ability to move people where they need to be, when they need to be there, is one of America's great strengths, and we hope to emerge stronger. The COVID crisis gave us a view of the abyss, but we're focused on a vision for the future, a vision for the future that includes enhanced sustainability. As my friend Pete Bunce said, we're focused on sustainable aviation fuel. It gives us an opportunity to dramatically reduce our emissions footprint. It's an opportunity for us to find a way forward together with government help, including a blender's tax credit. We're also working hard to bring new technologies to reality, to receive the benefit of new propulsion systems, hydrogen propulsion, electric propulsion, hybrid propulsion. We need an infrastructure that is capable of sustaining these operations, taking the magnificent airport infrastructure that we developed during World War II and building for the future, creating the type of charging stations and operational environments that will allow the advanced air mobility operations to thrive. We also know that it's important for us to continue to invest in our human infrastructure, to be able to attract the best and the brightest. And that makes a requirement that we be diverse and we be inclusive. I know this committee has been supportive of PSAs to attract people to our industry. It's been supportive in the FAA Reauthorization Act at creating a Women in Aviation Advisory Board that NBAA is proud to have 2 members of its board of directors serve on. It is imperative for us to realize the future. We have to be diverse, we have to be inclusive, we have to be sustainable, and we have to take advantage of the technologies that are working their way through the certification system. And we need to create an operating environment that can get us there. We're grateful for the leadership that has been demonstrated by this committee, by this Congress, and by the FAA to help us through a challenging time. But we want to set our sights forward, and we want to realize the full potential of aviation moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolin, for your comments. And I think that your last comments really wrap up maybe one of the themes coming out of today will be that although we are not out of the woods, there is some light there at the end of the tunnel. There's some opportunities to start thinking about the future of aviation, very different than what we would have been talking about even 6 months ago. But we still have work to do to get through the pandemic. I just remind people to mute, please. Everybody mute. Thank you. Very much, appreciate that. So I now recognize members for 5 minutes. I'll start by recognizing myself, and my first question is for Ms. Krause. Also, I would recommend to members to not ask questions generally of the panel, but to ask directly to panelists. It just makes it easier to manage the question time because of the technology. So my first question is for Ms. Krause. It's about the National Aviation Preparedness Plan. Since 2015, following your agency's recommendation to create a National Aviation Preparedness Plan to ensure all levels of government, airlines, airports, and frontline aviation workers are better equipped, we still don't have one. Representative Beyer and I have introduced HR 884 to direct the DOT to create a National Aviation Preparedness Plan. Could you elaborate on the GAO's recommendation for such a plan and what new issues should be addressed since your recommendation was released? Ms. Krause?
Hi, this is Heather. No, we also agree, and as I have said in my opening statement, urge Congress to take action to require DOT to implement a plan. I think the COVID-19 pandemic illustrated some real challenges with coordination and communication. And a plan would, in designing one, you'd want one that's scalable, adaptable, and has training built in as well, so that you are prepared for future communicable diseases. I think it also allows airlines and airports individual preparedness plans to align up with that national plan and have a more coordinated response.
Great. Yep. Thank you. And again, it's HR 884 if any members are interested in co-sponsoring that bill, sponsored by Representative Beyer and myself. Mr. Bunce, you mentioned the Aviation Jobs Manufacturing Protection Act, which is a bill that Representative Estes and I co-sponsored, and which Representative Chair DeFazio helped get language in the reconciliation bill for its implementation. The idea being that we could ensure for the long term we have an aviation supply chain workforce to call upon when the recovery comes. Can you elaborate a little bit more on your comments with regards to the job losses in the supply chain industry and what's needed to bring them back? Mr. Bunce.
Thank you, Chair Larson. That supply chain, as I mentioned, is global in nature. So even if we come back in the United States and are able to have some of our suppliers working, the entire industry has transitioned to just-in-time parts and pieces because of the quality of our delivery companies in this country. Around the rest of the world, it's not quite the same. And our supply chain is very fragile in that a lot of these countries have had lockdowns. And as you get further and further down the supply chain, that then ripples through the system. So what we have found lately is that our demand for aerospace products is actually not only forecast, but we have orders that are extremely robust. But we have had to stretch out the delivery times, the anticipated delivery times, because of the fact that the supply chain is still very disrupted. So think about if airlines aren't flying, all that cargo that's below the floor is not able to be delivered. And we know that a lot of our great cargo functions that are done by air are completely full with consumer goods and goods that are ordered off of the big online stores. So we also have a capacity constraint because we just don't have enough airline capacity in the air around the globe to move those parts and pieces. So that then translates to the loss of these jobs. And with this legislation that you have helped us with, we can retain some of those workers or bring back some of those workers in this cost share and get them off unemployment. And by that means, we can keep them from filtering to another industry because their skills are very precious to aerospace.
Yeah, thank you. So I have about 45 seconds left. Mr. Little, could you address the issue of concessionaires at the airports and the impact this has had on the folks who are running the shops at the airport and what you're doing to assist them? And you have about 30 seconds, sorry, Mr. Little.
Thank you, Chair Larson. As the concessions at the airports rely heavily on passenger traffic coming through the airport. And as you have heard before, passenger traffic significantly declined. We had a 60% or 61% decline in traffic. So our concessions community has suffered significantly. What we have done, we immediately responded by providing relief, both to rent and relief to MAG. And we did that twice during the pandemic, and this allowed many of our concessionaires, particularly the small minority women-owned businesses, to actually weather the storm and survive through the pandemic. And we're hoping that we'll get additional relief with the next CARES package coming out, so we can continue to provide this type of support and relief to our concessionaires here at the airport.
Thank you. Thank you. With that, I'll turn to Representative Graves of Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Mr. Little and perhaps Mr. Callio. There's been talk about a national preparedness plan, but I think at this point, looking more toward a recovery plan might make the most sense. We've, as discussed, we've carried out a number of actions to try to help to sustain the capacity through this pandemic. But so again, Mr. Little, Mr. Callio, if we were to talk about a national recovery plan, what would those metrics look like in your eyes in terms of moving toward an actual recovered industry?
Mr. Little, go first.
Okay. National recovery plan. I think the first thing that we'll have to do is to ensure that we do everything as an industry to ensure that we restore traveler confidence. I think with all good intent, the airlines is doing something, the airports are doing everything in their best effort as well. And I think though we have to have a coordinated approach. So we have to have, for example, the government participating with the airlines, participating with the airport, have a collaborative and coordinated approach to do everything within our power to restore customer confidence. So at the airport, for example, we will be, we'll be doing the hand sanitizer stations. We'll make sure we have social distancing, and the airlines, for example, will have mask mandate, etc. But I think we have to have a coordinated approach where, for example, the mask mandate is a very good example of that. We have to also ensure that we collaborate with the CDC, as an example, and the FAA and the Department of Health to not implement measures such as the one that was recently being discussed
Okay,
obvious.
Mr. Little, I'm running out of time. I want to make sure we have an opportunity to get to Mr. Callio. Mr. Callio, could you give a quick answer? I've got a couple more questions.
Yes. First of all, public education is important. That's why we went to Harvard and worked with the airports and with other airlines and manufacturers, everybody in the industry. That education has to continue and spread. We have to continue to create confidence by maintaining what we've put in place to keep our passengers safe and the flying public safe. And that goes across the board. And I would recommend to everyone, look to the recommendations in the Harvard report. Basically, we've got to rely on science and data in terms of opening the markets and going forward. And we've got to continue the partnership with the government that we've had over the last 12 months and make sure that we put whatever gets put in place is based on science and data and will not have unintended consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Callio. Captain DePete, there have been comments or questions about, and I mentioned this in my opening statement, about whether pilots were feeling, I guess, rusty as a result of the decrease in flights and passenger travel. Could you speak to that a little bit? Do you or your members have concerns about that? And could you talk about what y'all are doing to help address that?
Sure. Thank you, Ranking Graves. First off, I just want to say you helped solve that problem for us with PSP. It has been, to say it's a historic lifeline, that it was a critical bridge to recovery. I mean, it's inherently a plan towards recovery already built, and I thank you all for that. In terms of the training, I am fully 100% confident in the ability of our pilots. We here at ALPA, training is just ingrained in us, is like in our DNA. And so we've been working with all the stakeholders, with our companies, with our regulators, to ensure that the training is, consistently up to date. As we bring these airplanes back to awake, as we get into recovery, we've already got a plan in place to deal with that. The changes that we've had in our training have evolved over the many years since 1931, since the airline. I'll say this. Everything good that happens in aviation is a result of collaboration. I think Nick has said it, Ed Bowen has said it. We came together as a team.
Captain DePete, need to wrap up. We're at 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'll just finish with that. I can't overemphasize the importance of PSP to remedy that situation.
Thanks. Representative Graves.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, on June 2nd, Ranking Member Sam Graves and I requested GAO conduct a study to survey the aerospace stakeholders in COVID relief and recovery. We asked the GAO to have their preliminary results ready by March 2021, and the GAO will be discussing those results today. Chairman Larson, I ask unanimous consent to enter the request letter into the record. Also, testimony from the American Car Rental Association into the record for the hearing as well.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before I call on Chair DeFazio, just a heads up that Representative Perry and Representative Davids will follow Chair DeFazio. So Perry and Davids prepare, and Chair recognizes Chair DeFazio for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Callio, as you noted, there's studies that show if adjacent passengers are wearing masks on a plane that the risk of transmission is very low. Have you heard from the airlines since the Biden administration adopted a mandatory rule and the airlines are making announcements regarding that rule? Has compliance complaints and problems abated?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, they have. As you know, we supported the federal mandate to back up what we were trying to do. It puts it in a different perspective, and it's been very useful. And, in personal experience, I know you've been flying a lot as well. The quality of the announcements has gotten better. I think the quality of the enforcement has become easier because it gives the flight attendants and the pilots another tool to talk to people who is, I think you put it earlier, like to put the lollipop in their mouth or sip on a bottle of water for 6 hours. And other passengers don't like that. So it has made a material difference.
Great. Yeah, I wish Mr. Dixon had had the initiative when we asked about a year ago. But anyway, thanks. Mr. Little, how about airport compliance? After I made the request with Mr. Thompson to TSA, do you feel that airport compliance is going well?
Yes, and particularly at our airport, we are well above 95% compliance. And from what I've heard in discussion with the other airports within the industry, compliance is extremely high, and people are in general adhering to the mask compliance. There are a few outliers, but that's very rare.
Great. Mr. Callio, your airlines have been attempting to begin voluntary contact tracing. How's that going with the legal issues and CDC?
We're still in the nascent stages, Mr. Chairman, but it's going well. We think it's necessary and can work. As long as there's an understanding between us, CDC, and CBP about what it takes to make the program operate and provide uniform standards in place for the information and working out the privacy concerns, we think it will be very helpful to opening up international markets.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go off topic for a second. Mr. Bunce, I have been in touch with the new administration regarding the misguided steps of the FCC on the C-band auction, which could lead to RF interference. We might have a few planes falling out of the sky, but hey, people are going to have faster access to streaming movies on their cell phones. Would you expand on that just briefly, and how critical you think it is that we have some action restricting that?
Absolutely, Chair DeFazio. Thank you for helping us call this attention to the FCC. Unfortunately, they weren't listening, I think, in the last Congress. And what we're asking for is some very comprehensive testing to the impacts, particularly to radar altimeters. We use those a lot in both in helicopters and in fixed wing aircraft. And if you recall back to the light squared issue that we had many, many years ago, interference with the GPS, this is just a follow-on to that. And we all know spectrum is precious. We all know it's valuable, and we want this country to be very forward-leaning with 5G technology and that. But for the safety of the flying public and all of us that do fly, we've got to ensure that our equipment is not negatively impacted. The FAA used to have a very robust frequency spectrum manager who basically was the great authority, and that after a retirement and over time that's kind of diffused into multi offices within the FAA. And so we're asking just for some very robust testing to be able to help us prove that we are not going to have problems with the radar altimeter equipment.
Great. Maybe we should suggest to FAA that they appoint a point person on this very critical issue and really get their act together so we can make a case to a more receptive administration and FCC. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So noted. Thank you, Chair DeFazio. And now recognize Representative Perry of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Mr. Callio, at one point, the federal assistance to airlines was to be contingent upon the airlines agreeing to fully offset carbon emissions by 2025. So that's 4 years. And reducing their own carbon emissions by 25% by 2035 and 50% by 2050. Now, in my view, this appears to be the convenient legislative opportunism to re-regulate or refashion the airline industry in the wake of the pandemic that you raised concerns about in your testimony. So the one question is, or the first question is, if the federal assistance was contingent upon such non-pandemic factors, how would it have impacted the ability of the airlines to weather the crisis, and would such a framework have impacted the number of employees able to keep their paychecks and health benefits over the past 12 months?
Thank you, Mr. Perry. We think it would have negatively impacted the number of employees that we could keep on. We didn't think it had any place in COVID relief legislation that was designed to keep employees on the payroll, in which all the money was going directly to employees. And there's a place for everything, but putting these kind of important, in some ways, extraneous provisions in others on that legislation would have had a negative impact. I would point out that we were able to successfully fend it off because the flight attendants, the pilots, the machinists, the airlines all agreed that this legislation was about keeping people's jobs, not about trying to make advances on the environment, which I have to point out airlines have been doing for years to a significant degree and continue to do today.
And I agree with your answer. Now let me continue on. Your testimony asked Congress to refrain from adopting punitive policies that will otherwise harm our debilitated industry, noting that doing so will hamstring our ability to recover and undermine the basic underpinnings and purposes of the relief provided to our labor workforce. According to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, fuel costs are one of the largest, most variable airline expenses, representing between 15 and 20% of total expenses. Now, given this large share of airline expenses, it would seem that punitive policies impact the price of jet fuel and would have particularly devastating effects on the airline industry. Industry analysts are projecting that President Biden's policies to restrict domestic oil production will put inflationary pressures on the price of crude oil. Indeed, the WTI crude prices have already increased since the Biden administration imposed a moratorium on new oil and gas leases, translating into higher fuel costs for airlines. At the most extreme end, a potential hydraulic fracturing ban, as President Biden has called for on the campaign trail, is projected to more than double the price per barrel of crude oil. Even less extreme options, such as extending the existing moratorium on new federal drilling leases, would lead to a significant increase in crude oil prices over time. So, alternatively, the imposition of a low-carbon aviation fuel standard or some other alternative aviation fuel requirement would misallocate airline resources to higher-priced fuels, leading to higher overall fuel costs for airlines. These just mandates out of thin air, while the industry is not prepared to deal with or provide that different low-carbon fuel standard. So, the next question: can you expand upon the reasons why these policies would be contradictory to the purpose of the significant amount of relief this committee has provided to the industry during the COVID pandemic, specifically focusing on the impact such policies would have on the airline's ability to repay the debt incurred during the COVID pandemic, keeping existing workers on the payroll and offering low-price ticket options, as well as keeping existing services level?
Mr. Perry, obviously, fuel costs and labor costs are our two most important items. We are sensitive to any variation in those prices. If prices of fuel are lower, we can do better, fly more people and all of that. So we watch what's going on. I'm not sure that I'm capable of forecasting what is going to happen, but anything that works to the detriment of keeping people in the air and keeping our employees on, has an impact. And we, the airline industry and the aviation industry as a whole, are at a sensitive stage right now, a fragile stage. So we're hoping that people will look at the impact of whatever they do, not only on the industry, but on the traveling public.
I certainly thank the gentleman, and I yield back the balance.
Thank you. Before I recognize Representative Davids, just a heads up for Representative Mast and Representative Titus will be next after Representative Davids from Kansas, who is now recognized for 5 minutes. Representative Davids.
Chairman, well, I think today's hearing shows us just how important and wide-ranging the impacts of the aviation industry has on our country and the world. And as the representative from the 3rd District in Kansas, I have to tout that Kansas is the proud home of a very skilled aviation workforce, and that's throughout the supply chain, including companies like Garmin, Thales, Celix, Spirit Aerosystems, the list goes on. I only have a couple of minutes. So I'm really excited as we look at this flight path forward about the prospects of burgeoning new sectors. And we heard that mentioned earlier during the hearing, particularly around advanced air mobility, both because of the tremendous potential for new manufacturing in this country, in places like Wichita, Wichita, Kansas, and the potential to operate with low or zero emissions. And I am hoping that the bill that was also mentioned earlier, that I'm co-leading with Ranking Member Graves, HR 1339, will help set the foundation for how the federal government can help work with and promote advanced air mobility. So I think one of the things I would like to hear about, Mr. Bunce, you discussed the importance of the international safety cooperation under aviation bilateral agreement. And you also expressed a bit of concern about how validation programs are working. And I was hoping you could share with the subcommittee a little bit more detail around what your concerns are and how this impacts your membership specifically.
Thank you, Representative Davids. Our lifeblood is to be able to validate products across the globe. And we have bilateral partnerships that we have established to trust the safety competencies of Europe, Brazil, and Canada, and very soon probably the UK as they stand back up their authorities. But when it bogs down, and we know there's going to be a natural reaction to all of the certification scrutiny that happened over the last year. But what is happening is specialists on all the authorities are now diving into things that are not new and novel, and that they actually trusted each other previously. And what that does is it just really hampers the ability to deliver product across the globe. And so what we've got to do collectively is we've got to build back that trust and confidence between the world leading authorities so that they can basically trust each other's work. And once we get that going again, because right now our pathway for validation has been stalled, and we were seeing very good improvements up until 2020. And so this has been a setback, and we've got to work very diligently to bring it back to what it should be.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then I guess I wanted to kind of switch over to a little bit when it comes to the pilot preparedness and I know the requirements, the safety requirements and that sort of thing that Captain DePete that you had mentioned. I'm curious about just going forward, how you view some of the requirements that we're hearing about and what somebody like myself who is not a specialist should be thinking about, and questions that I should be asking when I have the chance to sit down with folks from, let's say, the CDC or other public health professionals who are trying to come up with what we need to do to get people comfortable with flying.
Well, thank you, Representative Davis, for the question. Airline travel remains the safest form of transportation known to humankind in the history of humankind. And when you think what we've accomplished, and we've all done it by collaborating, I keep hitting on that. And it's no different here. I mean, we've adopted a layered approach to handling the COVID crisis. I wish that there were earlier interventions on the part of government to help us along, but when that didn't happen, we joined all together and we created what we think is a really good series of mitigations. And when you look at possible transmission, say in the instance of a virus, it's out of 1.2 billion flights, and this was prior to masks being mandated, there were minute number of transmissions. So we have done a remarkable job, and our industry has done a remarkable job of instituting new technologies. We've worked with RTC. Okay, thank you. There's so much to say there. Sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. We'll talk more about it, Captain. I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Mast from Florida. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Bunce, I don't have a question for you. Just wanted to say, please tell Megan and Ashley that I say hello. For those of you that don't know, he has 2 daughters that have done absolutely yeoman work in helping injured service members recover from their injuries. So just truly patriotic family. Appreciate your work. Say hello to your daughters for me, if you would. I want to go to Mr. Callio and Mr. DePete for a couple of questions here. And this is a little bit of a general question. You touched on it just briefly, Mr. DePete, saying you wish there had been some interventions earlier. And I look back at what some other agencies have said, such as the World Health Organization, advising against any sort of travel or trade restrictions at one point. And would ask you guys to go back exactly 12 months so that we can look forward for the next time that something like this happens. God forbid it should ever happen again. Could we have prevented the distrust by traveling passengers to want to get on an airlines? Could we have prevented the businesses not having people travel around the country or the world? Could we have prevented the $54 billion a year loss, if you do the math on what you were saying, 1.5 million a day, or I'm sorry, whatever that number was that you gave us earlier, 150 million a day, 54 billion a year. What could have actually been done? Could that have been prevented or only limited to some degree? I'd ask you two to espouse on that a little bit if you could, for the benefit of all of us.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and a very important one. Yeah, I absolutely would say yes, and that's why we support the National Aviation Preparedness Act. We did it in the 116th. We're doing it again in the 117th when it's hopefully reintroduced, because it is important for us to look back and see what we've learned and debrief this as we go forward. However, let me just say this. Without a standardized set of guidelines, it was very confusing in my estimation, in the view of the Airline Pilots Associations for the flying public, right? Having one clear standard, I think, would have allowed us to build trust early, okay? And there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of confusion politically about wearing a mask and all these other associated problems that we dealt with. So the answer to your question is a most definite yes. And I think we'll be able to do a debrief once this is said and done and recovery is complete. And I think we'll all be able to learn through collaboration and coordination. Thank you.
Mr. Callio, I heard you speak. If you want to take about 30 seconds or a minute, I do have a few more questions, but please respond if you wish.
Yeah, I think we could have done better. There was a lot of confusion. It was a new issue, a new pandemic, so that is understandable in that regard. But right now, we're still sorting through that. We have so many different standards within the United States and across the world that somehow we need to focus on how to standardize this so people are not confused about where they can go, what they can do when they get there, and how the rules apply. And that's a current problem. And we have to be prepared for that in the future so we can avoid it. But we also need to sort through what is going on right now.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And I would go back to both of you on this. Now, there's been a lot of talk about requirements for testing, and I've heard various groups speak out against this. However, as you talk about this patchwork that exists around the country or largely around the world, whether pilots are being detained or crew being detained for quarantine or other things, there are some airlines right now that are running apps. I believe Qatar, Emirates, a few others that are running apps right now to verify whether passengers had a test or a vaccine. Now, let me go on record as saying I do not think that these should be requirements at all for travel, a test or a vaccine. But with some airlines running apps to track whether this has occurred and talking about standardization at the same time, what do you see going on in terms of the potential of a push for that across the aviation industry, which I do not want to see?
I think it's something that we're looking at, Congressman, in an effort to open up markets and give people the freedom to fly. We have some of our members looking at apps. We have a set of criteria, which I will be happy to share with you offline about if there is going to be such a thing, what kind of standards you have to apply and how you would do it. And, you know, all these things are looking at limited timeframes in order to, again, to deal with the current pandemic and to open markets so that people feel safe and are able to fly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Before I move to Representative Titus, heads up for the next two after that will be Representative Van Dyne and Representative Payne. I recognize Representative Titus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the hearing. Mr. Callio, it's nice to see you back in front of the committee. It's good to see you, have you here. You've talked about how domestic travel is having a relative recovery. Businesses and the industries and attractions are all adapting to the COVID protocols, but international travel remains anemic due to the restrictions here in the U.S. and abroad. Just in my district alone, international travel is down 93% from January of 2020. And I don't have to tell you how devastating that is to the economy. We know that although international travelers make up a small percentage of the market, when they come, they stay longer and they spend more. So it is important. We're moving into a new phase of the recovery now as the vaccines roll out. Places are opening up. The hospitality is now advertising, come back, we're back. Some point the international travel restrictions are going to ease, but I think we still have a public relations problem with international travel. We've had 4 years of a president who's alienated our allies and our business partners, trading partners, and then totally botched the COVID recovery. And now we're left here with a bad reputation and the worst death rate in the country. So I wonder about things like Brand USA. That was created over a decade ago as a public-private partnership, and it's been very effective. I wonder if you could talk about that partnership and also maybe some of the other ideas that your organization and the industry have in order to bring back international travel once we get over this, peaking situation with the virus.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and it's good to be before the committee again. I'm looking forward to the time when I can do it in person again. International travel is lagging terribly. And as you know, that's probably the most profitable part of our business. And so we have tried a number of things in terms of looking at testing, looking at contact tracing. We are working with the travel industry in general. We're all working together to try to bring it back, to let people know that it's, at the appropriate time, it's safe to come here and that you should come here. That again gets back to this patchwork internationally. We are in close touch with our partners in the EU, and within the EU, there's all these different standards. So it's going to take all of us with an education process going forward and making people feel welcome.
Thank you. I think it is a challenge. So let us know how we can help with that and see if we can't beef up Brand USA and other programs like that to get that message out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bunce, I'd like to ask you about general aviation. Las Vegas, we depend a lot on general aviation. A lot of people come there for pleasure or for business, or did. You mentioned in your talk that your sector is trying to be more responsive to your contributions to global climate change. One of the things that we have found, unfortunately, is kind of a chicken and an egg problem. The manufacturers will create a product that uses alternative energy, but then on the ground, we don't have the infrastructure for refueling or recharging. I wonder if you could discuss what role things like sustainable aviation fuel and electric airplanes are playing, and if you have established a symbiotic relationship.
Representative Tice, you called it exactly. As we look out to the future, and reality gives us the fact that we will not have large cabin aircraft running on electric anytime soon. NASA just released a picture of an aircraft about the size of a Q400, so a large turboprop, and they're saying about 2035. So if we're looking at larger aircraft, business jets and turboprops, but then in a commercial side, we have to have sustainable aviation fuel. And that's why your help in being able to spur supply for this product is very important. As Mr. Callio mentioned, you know, the airlines are very price susceptible to that price of fuel. Our sector in business aviation, there is a big effort right now on corporate responsibility and sustainability. So there's very high demand, and we're able to, although we use a small percentage compared to the commercial airlines, we are being leaders in the demand for this product because we know our future is tied to being able to fly sustainably. And so we're seeing a push in Europe. We're seeing a push in the U.S. Demand is high, but supply is just not there. And that's where that's why that blender's credit is very important to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Want to recognize Representative Van Dyne from Texas, a new member of the full committee, and this being her first aviation subcommittee. Welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you very much, Chairman Larson and Ranking Member Graves, for holding this necessary hearing today. The district I represent, Tex 24, is home to DFW Airport. It's also home to American Airlines, and right outside the district is Southwest Airlines, making it the largest, having the largest number of aviation employees in any district in the country. DFW Airport is also the #1 economic driver for the state, and it became the busiest airport in the world during the pandemic. But make no mistake, COVID-19 still wreaked havoc on it. 2020 was the worst year for the DFW Airport in more than 3 decades. The 40 million passengers who traversed the airport last year were the fewest since 1985. And when planes aren't taking off and landing at the airport, it isn't just airline carriers being affected. The entire ecosystem supports the airport but feels the pain, from the mechanics to the service workers to the small businesses that depend on high passenger volume. And obviously, through no fault of their own, the aviation industry is hurting. And while the stop-go solutions Congress has enacted during the pandemic have been helpful, the only long-term solution is opening the skies back up for business. I'm thankful for our witnesses being with us today, and I hope we can work together on this committee to support and not harm the industry as it rebuilds after this horrific pandemic. Over the last several years, government regulations have really helped to erode the passenger experience. We've all seen videos over time of families, coming back from Orlando and having screaming kids that are kicked off the plane because their 2-year-old won't wear their mask. People have a choice to travel, and if it's painful, they're going to decide not to do that. Mr. Callio, I'm going to ask you, what effect do you believe that mandating flight attendants to enforce constantly changing pandemic requirements has had on these recovery efforts? And do you believe adding additional policing requirements, such as mandatory testing, will help or hurt the recovery efforts?
Mandatory testing was an easy one, Congresswoman. That would be devastating to the domestic market. In terms of enforcing the face mask requirements, we think it's a necessity, and the videos that you see really represent a very small portion, a minute portion of what actually goes on day-to-day flights. And there's a lot to every story. I can't speak to each one of those, but we do know that it is important for all of our passengers to uniformly enforce the face mask requirement. Getting back to mandatory testing, we are doing it in an effort because it's scalable currently on an international level. But if it were to try to be imposed on a domestic basis, it would bring the market to a flat halt.
What do you believe is an approximate timeline for a full return to normalcy for commercial airline passengers in passenger capacity and revenues?
I would be in high demand if I could actually answer that. But as one of my board members, in fact, Gary Kelly from Southwest said to me the other day, we can plan, but we can't forecast. And what he means is the forecasts have all been wrong. It depends on so many different variables, yet the airlines have to plan. So you're likely to see probably an excess number of seats in the market over the summer in case people do come back. But if they don't get filled, that exacerbates the opposite. I mean, we're hoping that there's going to be a significant uptick by the end of the summer and throughout the fall. We're not going to see anything close to 2019, we don't think, until 2023 or 2024. We'd like to see it earlier. You know, what we need also, and part of that, leisure travel and domestically will come back first. We need the international travel that Congresswoman Titus talked about to come back, and we need business travel to come back, you know, where people will go again and sit down and cut a business deal safe, face to face.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Mr. Bolin,
Thank you.
like you, I am very concerned about the future of health-related regulations for airlines. In the full committee's markup on the budget reconciliation bill, I was proud to sponsor an amendment that didn't.
Mr. Bolin, could you mute until the question's over? We're just getting some feedback out of your microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In the full committee's markup on the budget reconciliation bill, I was proud to sponsor an amendment that didn't allow funds in the act to go towards a program mandating that passengers provide a negative COVID test before domestic air travel. What are some other regulations we should be worried about, both in the short and long term?
Well, I think that's a good example where we were looking at a requirement that was really not something that we have an infrastructure to address. And so I think going through this entire process, we have been working on things that we can do together, ways to move forward with that layered approach that Captain DePete talked about. So we're learning as we go. But I think it's important when it comes to mandates and requirements, we make sure that we have an ability to actually go through with that. And that's why I think these testing requirements, just at the domestic level, are so important.
All right, thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, I'll recognize Representative Payne from New Jersey. Representative Payne, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Yeah, Representative Payne, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize.
Sorry, Representative Payne.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Hello?
Go ahead. Yeah, 5 minutes. Go.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Callio, I'm deeply concerned about the pandemic's effects on the workers at my district's Newark Liberty International Airport. And, you know, these workers depend on the payroll support program during this historic decrease in air travel over the past year. I'm pleased that we've taken several steps to extend the PSP since the pandemic began, including funds in the American Rescue Plan that we passed last week. Can you please share with us how PSP has allowed companies to avoid massive layoffs, and what steps can we take to guarantee the money continues to support workers?
Congressman, thank you. Again, PSP, we believe, is the most successful provision in the CARES Act. It's done exactly what it was intended to do. Excuse me. It's kept workers online and on the payroll. That means they're not collecting unemployment. They're paying taxes, paying Medicare taxes as well, Social Security. The programs worked as intended. You know, if anything, if it could work better, it ended up being 70% grants, 30% loans and warrants. So it covered it, you know, in the first tranche, it covered about probably about 70% of the airline's cost in keeping their employees online. The simplest thing to do is have the Senate pass this extension. It will keep people online again until September 30th, and it will avoid many, many layoffs. It's again successful keeping people working and avoiding a lot of furloughs and layoffs that otherwise would have had to happen because of where demand is.
Thank you. Mr. Lytle, as you know, many of the workers at Newark are employed by the airport and not one of the airlines. They can be forgotten when talk about financial support and job protection is spoken of. What specific supports are necessary for all the people who work at the airport and not just the airline's employees?
Thank you, Representative Payne. The industry, aviation industry lost about 23 billion last year, and we're forecasted to lose 17 billion this year. The CARES Act monies that were afforded to us allowed us, for example, to provide relief to our concessionaires at the airport, but not only the airport dine and retail concessionaires, it allowed us to provide relief to the airlines, to taxi operators, to our all the concessionaires basically at the airport, rent-a-car companies, etc. And that allowed them not to have to lay off any employees or to provide furloughs to a lot of the employees. So it is critical that we continue to get this type of support so we can provide this relief to all the tenants here at the airport, because our survival actually depends on their survival as well. So we lost about $350 million last year, and without the CARES Act fund and the CRISA Act fund, we would have had to lay off people at our airport as well, which throughout the entire 2020, we did not have to do any layoffs.
Thank you. And I just like to remind my colleagues that this PSP program really, it does benefit passengers, but it is there to benefit the working people at the airports. And let's continue to make sure that everyone is considered during this pandemic, and not just the airline workers, but everyone at the airports. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Representative Payne. And I got to tell you, not everyone can pull off a bow tie with a golf shirt, but you certainly can, sir. Two announcements. First off is that in order, we'll have Representative Stauber, Representative Brown, and Representative Balderson. And the second is, although votes have yet been called, there was a note that votes will be called sometime between 11:30 and 11:45. Just a heads up for the committee folks. So with that, I'll recognize Representative Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Larson. Thank you, Ranking Member Graves, for holding this hearing. You know, there are some concerns that I have, and one of them is the CDC still recommends that people delay travel, you know, as much as possible. And then there's the Department of Defense study that found, in quotation marks, overall exposure risk from coronavirus is very low, end of quotations, and that you would have to sit next to a COVID positive passenger for 54 hours to get infected with airborne COVID-19. Since this pandemic, I have had the privilege to fly several airlines, and out of my hometown of Duluth, Minnesota, I fly Delta, and I can tell you that I feel very, very comfortable, not only in the airports, in the smaller airports that I frequent, but also boarding the plane. I think the airline industry has done a real good job under difficult circumstances to make sure that the passengers and those feel safe. And I can say that it's been almost a year now, and I think the airlines have been put in a difficult spot, but coming out of it. And I appreciate all the professionalism that you have shown. You know, the HEPA filters, for example, these are the same filters that are in our hospital surgical rooms. And I think that it's important that we recognize the advancement made in not only aviation safety, but aviation air quality as well. I can say, I would like to just make a comment to the fact, and this is to Nick, I'll ask the question in just a moment, but I also want to add that as governors across the state, when they shut down their entire states and the flying is limited or stated to delay your flying, that's also an economic hardship for those aviation workers. And we talked about, my colleague just mentioned the workers at the airports and the airlines. They get laid off. So there's a double whammy effect. You get laid off, you lose the income. So that's putting two negative things that happen. You get laid off, economy bad. You lose your income, and I think that it becomes a public health crisis, and that the secondary effect of a shutdown is poverty. So we have two crises going on, not only COVID, but the poverty, because you're taking their livelihood away, the ability to make a paycheck, which we call paycheck justice. I will say this to Nick. I just want to ask you something, and I may have talked to you before about this and others. The wearing of the masks is extremely important while you're flying. Under the American Disabilities Act and or certain medical conditions, I'm just going to give you an example. If you had a child who, for instance, has Down syndrome and a lower functioning child who can't, let's say the family goes on vacation and who can't wear this mask continuously because of the disability, how would most airlines respond to that? And how many cases has this happened? Because I'm reading that sometimes with babies or whatever, or younger children, can't keep them on. But can you tell me if there's a disabled individual on the flights, how would you handle that?
Thank you, Congressman. All of our members operate in their own way. They all operate within the guidelines that the government has provided. And it's, we're in the midst of a pandemic, and we hope that it's not going to go on forever. But again, the members make their own determination, and it's based on the science of mask wearing and what they can do. But there are guidelines from the government. We stay within those guidelines as we make a determination about who should and who should not wear a mask.
How about somebody who has a medical issue that actually can't put the mask over? Let's say they have asthma or something. Would the Airlines Association request that they not fly, or would there be any type of accommodations?
Again, that's up to our individual members, but for right now, I think many are saying that they should not fly. And the reason is because we have to protect the health of all of our crews and all of our passengers. And, the determination is that you need to wear a mask. There's also an aspect of it where other passengers get upset if somebody's not wearing a mask.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks for all the good work. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I recognize Representative Brown of Maryland for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our panelists for bringing your experience, your knowledge, your perspectives and observation to this committee today. Captain DePete, question for you. In your testimony, you mentioned, this was your written testimony, that central to the rationale for the PSP is keeping pilots and other mission critical employees available to respond quickly as demand returns to the industry. You say that pilots cannot simply return from unemployment to operate airline aircraft. They are subject to recency, training requirements, and medical approvals and safety clearances. As a former Army pilot, I certainly appreciate and understand the idea, the concept of diminishing skills, and that time away from the cockpit can contribute to just that and put at greater risk both pilot and crew and passengers in flight operations. So, Captain DePete, when a pilot is furloughed, how does that impact their ability to get back on the job once they're rehired? Kind of share with us a little bit about sort of diminishing skills and why we need to keep pilots and air crews flying.
Thank you for the question, Representative Brown. Good to see you again. Great question. And Look, thankfully, we can say that through the hard work of this committee with PSP, you've made that pretty easy for us. We haven't really had to deal with that too much. But if March 31st goes by and we don't have a solution, we may be looking at more of a problem there. But however, the way the training works and the certifications work is that the longer you're out, right, the more the training is required to come back in. However, saying that, the training is exactly the same. You will be 100% ready to go and do it again. I mean, we train to the very highest standards. But I think that's the important thing to realize is that if we want a rapid recovery, it's so important that we get this next installment of the PSP so that we don't have to deal with those kinds of issues. Because the longer it takes to spool up, if we're faced with an accelerated curve here pretty soon as we begin getting recovery, we want to be ready for that. And I'd say I'd ask you, listen, just ask yourself one question. If it wasn't for the PSP and if it wasn't for a healthy airline industry, what would COVID have really looked like? It was bad enough, but could you imagine if we didn't have the PPE, the ventilators, we didn't have those supplies coming in, moving healthcare workers left and right, and saving the holidays and for people to be able to ship things and food on shelves. I mean, it would have been disastrous. What I'm trying to say, Representative Brown, is you did a great thing, and the committee needs to be rewarded for that. Hats off to you.
Well, thank you for your response. Let me go over to Mr. Callio. In your written testimony, you mentioned that U.S. airlines have implemented multiple layers of measures aimed at preventing virus transmission aboard the aircraft. You also outlined a number of those today, including strict face covering requirements, pre-flight health forms, enhanced disinfection protocols, and hospital-grade filtration systems. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that the airlines are facing in sort of implementing those safeguards and those measures? What has that experience been like? Who is primarily responsible for implementing those, and what has been the response from the flying public?
I guess I'd start at the end, Congressman Brown. The response from the flying public has been very good. We all know that some people don't like to wear masks, but the visibility of the enhanced cleaning procedures has been very well received. Knowledge about the HEPA filters has been extraordinarily well received because most people didn't know that or didn't understand that. And, it takes more for us. It takes more, using our employees more. Maybe takes a little longer to turn an airplane around, but these are all measures that we view as worthwhile because of what they are producing in terms of the health and safety of our passengers and our crews. And like I said earlier, we've leaned very heavily into the science. And any decision that's made is based on data and science. And, when we engaged this Harvard study, we made sure it was independent. That wasn't always easy, but they made some recommendations about ventilation during boarding and deplaning. We all now do that now, what they recommended. In terms of how we board and how we deplane, we're trying, behavioral comes into that because you can tell people to, deplane by the road, but you still have people who want to get up and knock you over to get off the plane first. I can tell you that by personal experience. I'm not that big a guy. So at any rate, it takes a lot more effort, but they're not going away. They're going to be in place forever because they made the flying experience better and safer.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Representative Balderson for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Thank you for our guests joining us today. My first question is for Mr. Bolin. How are small business owners and operators recovering from the pandemic, and how does their recovery look going forward?
Well, I appreciate the question very much because, as I said before, 85% of the companies that rely on business aviation are small and mid-sized companies. And our infrastructure is often in small towns, individual airports. And so it's a very fragile infrastructure. But the PSP program has been enormously important to us. The ability to keep general aviation airports with some degree of operational revenues coming in, the opportunity to keep aviation professionals who we've invested heavily in for their training, to keep them active, all of that has been fundamental to our ability to survive the COVID crisis. Going forward, though, we need business travel to come back. We need the economy to be strong. And we're hoping that the steps that we're taking now can get us there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bolin. My next question is for Mr. Callio. Mr. Callio, thank you for being here. We have previously discussed the ongoing pilot shortage in the United States. Even with the pandemic-related downturn airlines have faced in the last year, Boeing predicts North America will need over 200,000 new pilots by 2039. Do your member airlines remain concerned about a shortage of pilots and maintenance technicians?
Thank you, Mr. Alderson. Right now, I would be candid to say that our main concern is survival. And the pilot shortage is not what it was, given the number of flights that are in the air. Hopefully flying comes back, and it will be. And there's a number of steps that have been taken and are being taken to ensure that that pilot supply is plentiful. And that's reaching down to schools and educating people about the advantages of becoming an airline pilot or a machinist. These are really good paying jobs with really good benefits, and they last a long time. You know, our average pay, you know, all the way down the line for all of our employees is higher than most other industries. I guess I would make kind of a comment that one thing that Congress could look at is, you know, if you can get a student loan to become an accountant, why can't you get a loan, or why can't the government back someone who wants to be a pilot? Pretty simple matter. Right now, it doesn't exist. So that may be something we can talk about that would help ease that pilot shortage going forward.
Follow up, how can the federal government and your member airlines work together to ensure there is a pool of qualified individuals in the aviation industry in the future? And I think you just brought up a great point. Captain DePete, I would also, if you could extend your thoughts on that same issue, since Mr. Callio gave a really good thought.
Sure. Thank you, Representative Balderson. No one is more invested in the future of the profession than the Airline Pilots Association. We have a professional pilot development group that is, consists of our leadership, membership, and education committees. We have various LOAs with schools around the country to encourage people to come into the profession. And we're constantly building and protecting the profession to make sure that it's a profession that people want to come to. Because when we talk about the word shortage, I think we need to ask ourselves a little question as to when this is all said and done, as to why, where would they be, where are the choke points for that to happening? When you look at what goes on amongst the smaller carriers right now, there's a tremendous amount of turmoil there. We've lost ExpressJet, we've lost Compass, we've lost Trans-States. It's a very unstable entry point into the industry. So we think we need to really tackle some of the bigger issues as to what the real reasons for the shortage are. And then now when we do get, how am I doing on time? Okay. When we do get the recovery going, I think with all the people who took voluntary outs to help their fellow pilots and companies to survive, we'll need to look at that question. But together with what we're doing with professional development, our diversity and inclusion efforts here at the Airline Pilots Association, I think we'll be in pretty good shape.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, thank you, Mr. Balderson. The chair now recognizes Mr. Stanton for 5 minutes.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to each of the outstanding witnesses in today's hearing. In my home state of Arizona, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a major negative impact on two key economic engines for our state and region, Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, as well as Phoenix Mesa Gateway Airport. After a year in which Sky Harbor had a record 46 million passengers, boardings in 2020 dropped by more than half. We haven't seen that level of boardings in over 30 years. March is typically one of the busiest months in Sky Harbor, yet with many major events delayed or with limited attendance, recovery continues to be slow. Fewer passengers, of course, means less revenue from concessionaire sales and revenue from parking, as well as fees from companies operating at the airport. Just to break even in this challenging time, the airport must reach 80% of the passenger boardings it had in 2019. Even with the support provided to Sky Harbor and other airports under the CARES Act and the December COVID relief package, the airport has had to significantly trim costs, reducing its operating budget by $30 million this year and next in anticipation of sustained revenue losses. In addition, Sky Harbor has placed on hold 80% or $800 million worth of capital projects that were planned for the next 5 years. This not only delays much needed infrastructure improvements, but thousands of potential construction jobs as well. Similarly, Phoenix Mesa Gateway Airport has seen passenger boardings plummet, concessionaires operating at half capacity, and infrastructure projects delayed. I have a question for Mr. Lytle. Mr. Lytle, let's talk about infrastructure at airports for the moment. Can you discuss the importance of the additional airport funding in the American Rescue Plan to support current and future infrastructure projects at your airport and at airports across our country?
Yes, thank you. The additional funding that we are hoping that we'll get from the American Rescue Plan is going to go a long way to help us. We have significant amount of debt service these are fixed cost debt service and operating costs, not only at my airport, but airports across the industry. So we're really looking forward to getting hopefully that additional $8 billion for the industry. We still have major infrastructure projects that we're undertaking right now. Even at my airport, we have $3.7 billion worth of construction that's taking place. We expect that traffic will return. The industry has always been resilient, and we know that it might take longer for this one, but traffic will come back, and we have to make sure that we have the facilities in place in order to accommodate the traffic that's coming back. And so the American Rescue Plan additional funding that the airports will be getting will be sorely needed for us to continue our operations.
Thank you very much. And a quick question for Mr. Callio. As more COVID vaccines are administered, governments around the world are exploring the use of digital health passports to encourage travel and facilitate a return to normalcy. Congressmember Mass asked a similar question, but I wanted to follow up on that. What are your thoughts about digital health pass and what necessary safety elements need to be in place before current travel restrictions are lifted?
Thank you. We think that verifiable testing and vaccination data is critical to the return of travel. We do believe that there are principles that should be applied across the board to make this workable and protect the rights of passengers. We would be happy to brief the committee on where we stand on this, because we have laid out a series of elements that we think ought to be in place to make these health passports both workable and as easy on passengers as possible.
Okay, well, I look forward to following up with you, and then maybe an opportunity for you to brief this committee, because I think digital health passes provide some optimism about speeding up the process of returning to normalcy in the industry. I yield back.
Okay, Mahalo, Mr. Stanton. The chair now recognizes Mr. Nels for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My questions or comments are really geared towards Mr. DePete, and I want to thank you for what you do representing the 59,000 members in the airline industry. Your comments regarding this committee, this subcommittee, and the support that you have received with the PSP program. This is all about a partnership and doing everything we can to keep the airline industry and the American people flying. My comments or questions are more geared to your written testimony as it relates to international travel. And in your written testimony, you talk about some of the airline employees, whether they're pilots or crew members. You reference Hong Kong and the horrible conditions, the substandard conditions in some of the hospitals where COVID positive the pilots that have tested positive for COVID are locked in some of these hospital rooms with other patients in deplorable, substandard government quarters for days. One of the employees being detained for 3 weeks, and you mentioned in your written testimony that you believe that the government should intervene or do something about this, and I wholeheartedly support that idea that when American citizens, when your members, employees are are in foreign countries and they test positive for COVID, that we should try to find a way to help get those people safely evacuated back to the great US of A. It's not only those that have tested positive for COVID, but some of the stories I'm hearing regarding employees that are flying into foreign countries. An example, I'm hearing stories about, Tokyo and Seoul, where the pilots and crews are being escorted to their hotel, and then they're subject to, they're locked in their hotel, and it can be for days because these layovers could be 3, 4, 5 days. Even worse, I've heard a story, and whether it's Sydney, Australia, where police are escorting the crew and the pilots to a hotel. They're locked in their hotel room without the key, and they can't leave their hotel room. And I can't imagine what it'd be like to be in that condition for 3, 4 days, knowing that you're eventually going to have to take the flight back. How has this type of treatment overseas affected your members? Has it affected the morale or maybe operations? Are you seeing more employees saying, I'm calling in sick, there's no way I'm going back to Sydney, Australia? If you could help me with that. And what can we do to help you?
Thank you, Representative Neal. That is a great question. And it's a problem, and you laid it out quite well. I mean, upon entry of our crews, like say, for instance, in Hong Kong, for example, they're administered a test. If they come up positive, they're put in Asia World Expo Center for an unlimited time, mixed up with other people who are COVID positive. If they're in close contact with somebody who was COVID positive, they're brought to Penny's Bay, another type of facility like that. There are oftentimes we've heard from our crews that the conditions are deplorable. I have pictures of them, and you just wouldn't believe. In addition, if there's additional testing necessary, they're now drawing blood from these pilots, several vials often in a day. This strikes at the very heart of the dignity of work. And in terms of the effect on the pilot's morale, it has a deleterious effect. I mean, our pilots are now, every time they start to let down and enter the airspace, they're wondering if they're coming home again. And we do need help. We've been talking to our carriers to try to work out a solution. The solution is to just stop the layovers in Hong Kong in that specific instance until the situation improves. And we could use the help of the committee for sure. We can use the help of our carriers to consider that as well. But hopefully in this new administration, we're looking for a glimmer of hope in this situation, because these are the very people who put themselves in harm's way to make sure that those PPE, ventilators, and healthcare equipment came back to us. So we do need the help, and I appreciate the question. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. DePete, for that answer. And you have my attention. I hope you have the attention of the other members of this committee. But thank you for being with us today.
Okay, thank you. The chair would now like to recognize Mr. Lamb for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. I wanted to start quickly, if we could, and I apologize if you covered this while I was off, the issue of vaccinations for frontline airport workers, in particular the TSA. I'm aware that at least in Pittsburgh International, where I represent, most of them have not had the opportunity to be vaccinated. I don't know if the picture looks different around the country, but given the amount of contact that they have to have every day and their importance to our national security, are you aware of how that process is going overall, and anything we can do to speed it up besides just increase the vaccine amount, which we, of course, are trying to do? And that's just a question for any witness that can tell us about progress or challenges.
Okay, Congressman, I'll take a crack at that. TSA workers are obviously essential workers. They ought to be frontline in terms of getting the vaccination, in our view, just as we believe that pilots and flight attendants and machinists should be as well, because it's all part of an ecosystem. And it would be good to lend some rationality to who is and who is not a frontline worker. And there's, given the demand for vaccination, you can understand the problems, but we do believe that we could do better, that the TSA workers ought to be frontline, as should our crews.
I agree. My hope is that with the addition of Johnson & Johnson now,
Yeah.
TSA in particular will be prioritized the way the teachers are in some states that are getting those additional vaccines. My other main question, and there may be a couple of you that want to address this, is the area that I come from represent. We still have a lot of steel makers, a lot of people who split their business between defense work and aerospace work, and they've seen a big drop off, obviously, in aerospace orders in the past year. My question is, I know that we've done a lot to try to support the payrolls of the airlines, to try to support the operations of the airports. Have we done enough to help companies continue to stimulate demand in aerospace manufacturing? So to get orders of replacement parts and maintenance back online, to get new aircraft back online. Have we done enough there, or is there more that you think we can do to help that part of the steel and manufacturing industry recover?
Well, Representative Lamb, speak on, so I'll start. I think if we can get through the reconciliation process, the Aviation Manufacturing Jobs and Protection Act that Chair Larson and Representative Estes has championed, and I know we have good sponsors in the Senate as well, that will help a lot, because anyone in that supply chain will be able to qualify to help bring back those workers. And that's really important. As you pointed out, that supply chain stretches all the way down to raw materials. And once you you qualify as being on a certified aviation product, you would qualify for this assistance. So it's very important.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. That's a great piece of legislation by Chairman Larson, and I hope we can get it through.
Representative Lamb, this is Captain DePete. I didn't get to my mute button, but would you mind if I just added my opinion about your first question? And, and it gets back to what I just described internationally. The very pilots who are tasked with bringing the vaccine home for us and charting the path towards recovery are not prioritized to get the vaccine in such a way. They should be up higher, to protect the integrity of the effort to get it out to the public. So it's just something to consider. I never could quite understand how pilots being tasked with doing that are not able to be prioritized in a higher priority to get the vaccine. So.
Yeah, I agree that it's a big problem, and my hope is it's going to be fixed as the administration continues to add millions of doses a week that are being shipped out. But we will definitely keep our focus on it. Thank you all for testifying today, and I look forward to working with you going forward. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Lamb. Chair recognizes Representative Massey, but before he is recognized, I'm sorry, Delegate Norton, or Representative Norton, and Representative Fitzpatrick will follow Representative Massey. Representative Massey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Looks like my button's okay, it's just not illuminated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to offer this cautionary tale for anybody who is considering the misguided policy of requiring testing before boarding a plane domestically. I have some constituents who went to Cabo San Lucas and before returning back to the United States, pursuant to the executive order that went into place on January 26th, they took a COVID test. They were asymptomatic. They tested positive for COVID. They took another test. They took a third test after waiting some time. The family failed all three tests, and so they were told to quit testing and to wait 14 days. Now, this is a family who could be able to do that, so they decided they would wait 14 days and then try to board the flight back to the United States, but they couldn't get a doctor in Mexico to sign off on that, and the airline requested that they get a doctor to sign off on the fact that they had, pursuant to CDC guidelines, been quarantined for 14 days. So they flew to Tijuana, walked across the border to the United States, got on an airplane in San Diego, and then returned to Kentucky. Now, not every family or student or employee could afford to do that, but that's the kind of chaos that would ensue, I believe, if you had some kind of testing required for domestic flights. So I hope we don't do that, and I hope that some kind of common sense prevails in the face of this January 26th executive order. Mr. Kallio, do you have any ideas for how we could clarify that executive order or implement it so that if it's going to be in place, it could be more workable.
Well, the order that's in place is for international testing, and I know you're using it in international, but you know, we support the international testing requirement. It's a means of opening up borders and making everyone feel, including the governments, more secure. But I think the patchwork of requirements makes it very difficult and very uneven in its application. And that's one of the things we talked about earlier, and the need to try to get a handle on that so that these kind of situations do not occur.
Got it. Thank you. I hope there's not too much enthusiasm for this, quote, immunity passport as a requirement for traveling, because I think you made a good case here today that the likelihood of transmitting or receiving COVID on an airplane is less than being in a supermarket. So if you're going to make the case that you need this kind of passport for an airplane, then you're basically trying to make the case you need it everywhere. And I think that's misguided, especially since the CDC says that the vaccine doesn't necessarily imply that you won't transmit the virus or have any sort of immunity. So I hope we abandon that idea as well. Mr. Little, I want to ask you about the effect of indoor dining bans on concessionaires at airports. Our governor saw fit to ban indoor dining for a while, and yet you have passengers who are in airports. It's not like they have a choice that they could go home and eat, who couldn't eat. The solution in that case was sort of ridiculous. It was to move the chairs and tables outside of the dining area and into the common area, and then to serve the airport passengers, and then they would eat it out in the common area. Long story short, nobody, was going home or not dining. Can you talk about the effect the indoor dining bans have had on the concessionaires who are already extremely in an extreme hardship due to COVID, Mr. Little, and maybe some solutions?
Yeah, thank you. Indoor dining has ban on indoor dining has been devastating. Thankfully, we are back to 25% right now. And what I think the states, for example, need to understand is that dining within an airport is different than dining outside. Indoor dining actually helps with social distancing, because what you're doing, you're actually providing an additional space within the restaurant for people to social distance. If you do not have indoor dining, but you're still selling food and beverages, then everybody actually congregates at the hold room area, and it's very hard to social distance. So because you're in an airport, you're confined. You can't go somewhere else as if you're outside. And I think the states really need to understand that the airport dining and retail is really different from outside. So it's really devastating when you actually stop indoor dining. But it defeats the purpose, because we're not able to do social distancing, because you have taken away a substantial portion of the airport that we actually need to facilitate social distancing.
Thank you, and I hope the governors will listen to you. I think the indoor ban on dining is ridiculous to start with, and if it's meant to discourage people from congregating at restaurants, then and the only place you can eat in an airport is at a restaurant, then it's going to discourage people from
Thank
flying.
you.
I yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
I recognize Congresswoman Holmes Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this hearing on COVID's effects on airline travel. And my questions are worker-oriented. My first question is for Captain Joe DePete. I was concerned and actually a little surprised at the increase in pilot errors in the past few months. Now, I know it's important to keep pilots employed and to keep them trained. Before COVID, what were the training requirements for pilots? And have there been any changes in the flying time requirements since the pandemic? Or how would you account for the increase in pilot errors, Captain DePete?
Thank you, Representative Norton, for that question. I have not seen the same statistics come across, other than a few anecdotal comments in the press from time to time. However, we have the highest training standards in the world, which has led to the safest national airspace ever known in the history of aviation. I mean, we're the envy of the world. And we've done that through constant examination, through a massive data collection that has allowed us to actually almost have a risk.
Have there been any changes since the
No, ma'am.
since the pandemic in training at all?
Nope, qualifications, ma'am, remain the same. And we are working with our carriers right now to ensure that we get the timely training we need, since there's less flying going on at the moment. But this is of highest priority for us, is to maintain our currency, and it's by law. I mean, it's by regulation that we have to maintain our currency. So
you say the pilots are flying the same number of hours each week? I mean, they're not flying as often.
right.
How many hours would a typical pilot fly each week or each month?
Well, they're flying less overall, but they still have to meet the mandatory requirements of our recency of experience. So many takeoff and landings in a given time period within 90 days. And it's up to the carrier to ensure that the training takes place and they meet those recency requirements, or else we go on current. So
You say you haven't seen the data we have on pilot errors increase in the past few months.
Right.
I'm going to ask the chairman to send you the data we have, so
Okay.
that we can have an explanation of why there would be an increase in pilot errors, particularly with fewer people flying at this time. Could I ask you another question, Captain?
Sure.
I noticed in your testimony, you touched briefly on the power of worker-centered industry relief, and said that was more important than corporate trickle-down relief that has been employed in previous crises. So I wanted you to elaborate on that. Would you mind sharing in greater detail why you think it is important to keep the workers affected by this crisis front and center?
Yes, ma'am. I would glad, and I'll just start right there, because I know that the investment in the workers in keeping aviation healthy is the pathway to recovery. And to just juxtapose what it was before PSP, if you recall back in 9/11, the devastating effect that had on the industry, when there wasn't a worker forward PSP type package like the CARES Act provided initially, and the subsequent PSCP payments. But back then, it was the Airline Transportation Safety Stabilization Act that formed the stabilization board. And the result of that exclusively being aimed at the industry and not at workers resulted in 50 bankruptcies and givebacks from workers of over $83.5 billion, including the very retirement security of many of those workers. So it was a colossal failure. And that's why I have to tip my hat to this committee to say that PSP is without a doubt the most historic, worker forward, critical bridge to recovery. I think it showed great thought and planning, and it is the road, because if we do not have a healthy.
Can I get one more question? Can I get one more question in?
Yes, ma'am.
I was very concerned about what I've read about traffic levels.
Congresswoman Norton, it's 5 minutes. If you want to ask the question, then we'll take the answer for the record.
Actually, it's for Ms. Kraus.
Unfortunately, we'll have to take the answer for the record. So you can ask the question, we'll take the answer for the record.
Oh, okay, so let me get the question in then. She testified that levels may not occur, and I think this is very important for this committee to find out, that traffic levels may not occur until 2023 or later. I think this committee needs to know how she came to that notion. We see already the progress that has been made, and that's 2 years from now for traffic levels in air travel. And I think this committee needs a response to that question. If you would submit that question to Ms. Kraus, I would very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We'll do that, Ms. Kraus. We have that question for the record. And with that, We'll now move to Representative Fitzpatrick, followed by Representative Garamendi and Representative Burchett. Representative Fitzpatrick, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this very important hearing. Thank you for the panelists for your time. First question for Captain DePete. Sir, I recently reintroduced HR 911. Congress had previously passed this legislation that it introduced. Congress passed a requirement for the installation of secondary barriers on new aircrafts. And my bipartisan bill seeks now to make all commercial passenger aircraft have this important safety measure. Are secondary barriers still a necessary security tool in your opinion? As you know, sir, this was one of the 9/11 Commission recommendations that is yet to be fully implemented.
Representative Fitzpatrick, thanks for that question, and thank you for your leadership on this issue over the years. I mean, I know you see the value of this, and yes, we are extremely frustrated at the lack of progress. It is ever more important that we have secondary barriers to preserve the reactionary gap when that door is opened, to protect our flight crews and the folks on the airplane. We have the PIC has a responsibility for the safe and secure conduct of a flight. And when you consider that this was in FAA reauthorization 2018, 115.254 was the public law, and we still, I remember being part of this reexamination to take a look at it again, where they basically started with, well, what do we mean by a secondary barrier? That's how bad it got. My hope is that I think there's many that share this frustration, but that with this new administration, we can urge them to move forward and get this taken care of. I mean, it's a long time coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Pete. And secondly, regarding the PSP, I'm a big believer in the program and extending it. And if you, sir, could just state for the record, we may have covered this ground, but I want to make sure it's on the record.
Sure.
You know, how this program has helped and benefited your pilots.
Well, it helped us by having a worker-focused effort for payroll and benefits, to keeping people connected with healthcare and off the unemployment insurance rolls, supporting and contributing still to the economy, and providing a pathway to recovery, because there is no recovery without a healthy airline industry. And PSP, like I keep saying, it was just a historic lifeline, not only for workers, but for our country.
Thank you, Captain. Thank you for all you do to keep our airways safe. We appreciate your work, sir. One last question for Mr. Callio. Sir, if you could also, for the record, talk about the PSP program and what it's meant to the airline industry on the whole.
Thank you, Congressman. The program is and is an unmitigated success. It allowed us to keep our workers on payroll, you know, as Joe has indicated, kept them out of the unemployment lines, paying taxes, spending money, and most importantly, up to date and ready to help the recovery. The flight path to recovery is going to require airline workers and airlines to be able to fly people and packages. And, you know, you cannot overlook the fact also, as has been mentioned before, flying around the PPE, the vaccines and all that. So the program's gone to keep people on the payroll. The airlines were more than happy to act as the federal government's and the state and local government's unemployment office because it was a lot better than the alternatives. And keeping these people on and happy and employed is critical to us because they are the backbone of our industry.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate all you've done for the industry. It's always a tough job you have. It's been especially challenging during COVID, so just know you're appreciated. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're waiting for members to return from votes, but I want to ask if Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson from Texas is on. No? All right. Representative Johnson from Georgia. All right, we'll go with then back to the GOP side, and Representative Jimenez from Florida. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
I represent Miami-Dade County, and Miami-Dade County, Miami International Airport is the #1 economic generator in Miami-Dade County. It supports probably over 300,000 direct jobs or indirect jobs. So aviation is vitally important to us. So I got a question for Mr. Callio. What percentage of, and from the height in 2019, what's been the drop off in the number of flights around the country, percentage-wise?
50%.
So we're now operating around 50% capacity?
No, we're actually operating at less capacity in terms of passengers who are flying. We're flying about 40% of the passengers that we did in 2019, and we're operating about 50% of the flights that we did in 2019.
That's and you expect us to be back to somewhat normal in 2023, 2024?
We sure hope so. If it comes sooner, so much the better.
Okay, let's talk about what percentage of your passengers in 2019 were actually business travelers?
Congressman, I can get that to you. I don't have it off the top of my head, but significantly more than we see now. Business travel is off really substantially, as is international travel. And a lot of the international travel was made up of business travelers. So that usually lags and passed both after 9/11 and after the financial crisis. Business travel lagged leisure travel in coming back.
Do you think that with what we're doing right now, normally you would be sitting in this chamber, but you're not. Do you see a significant drop off in business travel just because the COVID-19 has changed the way that we do business? Do you see that as having an impact on the airline industry?
Potentially, it can. Our hope is that it won't, because I personally think a lot of people still like to do business face to face. There's a lot of Zoom fatigue going on right now. And so I think that business travel will come back. It's just going to take time.
Let's get back to international travel, because at MIA, the airport that is in the county that I represent, 50% of the air travel is international in nature. When do you expect that to start to come back?
That depends on what happens with vaccinations and quarantines and international testing. Right now, we still face this patchwork. As I mentioned earlier, you can't get the countries within the EU to agree with the European Commission. We have our own. We're trying to do bilaterals to encourage people to go ahead and fly. You've got to be able to fly somewhere and then have something to do and somewhere to stay. The notion that you're going to fly and spend 7 to 10 days in a hotel without being able to go out is not very conducive to making the trip. So it remains to be seen. Again, hopefully, as we get the virus under control, as vaccines ramp up, things will get better. But we can't forecast when. We do expect it's going to be some time.
Is the airline industry doing something on an international basis to try to get some sort of international accords on getting back to normal, what it would take for international travel to resume again from country to country? Say, does the United States have something with the European Union? I know, like you told me right now, they're a little bit disjointed. Is there any way that we can help to try to unify this and try to get a concerted strategy on how to get international travel started again?
Well, the administration has been a willing partner, Congressman, in working on the testing and health or the vaccine requirements. And we think that's starting, I guess, you have to say, you need to start small, and that's on a bilateral basis, which we've done with the UK, Germany, the Netherlands so far, among others, and we're going to continue on that basis. And that's a matter of, we as the U.S. airline industry are working with individual countries. We're working with the European Commission, and we're working with our government. A concerted effort on part of all those governments to work together to open up those markets safely is what's actually needed.
And how can you accomplish that?
Apparently slowly. I'd like to say otherwise, but it takes a lot of work because everybody's making their own decisions. It's just like within the United States. There's multiple jurisdictions with multiple quarantine requirements. There has to be a look at the whole picture. It's very
Thank you very
difficult
much.
when you
I'm
look
out of time, and I yield back.
Okay. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, Representative Jimenez. And I wish every member would respond like that to a gavel. I appreciate it.
Try to follow the rules, sir.
Bonus point. I think we're still waiting for folks to come back from voting, but I believe Representative Van Drew from New Jersey, his camera is on, if Representative Van Drew is available.
I am. I'm here.
Great. Representative Van Drew, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. COVID has decimated America's aviation industry. We as a nation must make robust upgrades to airports and aircraft across the country. We must adapt to COVID and build a stronger air travel system that is more resilient to all communicable diseases. This process must be led by the industry, but the federal government has an important role to play in establishing clear national standards. My Health Smart Air Travel Act establishes a program that will have the federal government work with industry stakeholders to test technologies, identify best practices, and clarify policies so that we can modernize air travel. My legislation has been carefully crafted and has broad industry support. If enacted, it will ensure worker safety, restore consumer confidence, and put American aviation on the pathway to recovery. I will be reintroducing the Health Smart Air Travel Act in the coming weeks. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation in a bipartisan way and to get us flying again. To Director Krause. Director Krause, in your testimony, you say several airports you interviewed told you that they expect a range of new technologies and processes to be implemented across the air travel experience to make flying safer for the public, some of which could benefit from federal government evaluation and federal government support. Would a federal program designed around partnering with industry stakeholders to develop, test, and evaluate public health risk mitigation technologies in airports and aircraft help address the needs of the airports that you previously interviewed?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, we spoke to a number of airports and they are pursuing or considering and implementing a number of different technologies, a lot of touchless options, biometrics, UV disinfection, as well as different ventilation systems. It is important that these technologies be evaluated and tested to ensure their effectiveness and also their risk mitigation effectiveness as well. We are looking to your question on the federal role. We have some work ongoing for this committee looking at DOT and FAA's role in supporting aviation or any research on the safety of or improving safety for the air travelers, as well as getting a sense of what R&D has been done, what R&D is needed, and what's FAA's capacity to support that research.
Okay, thank you very much. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Van Drew. Again, still waiting for members to come back and have that opportunity to ask questions, but so I'll formally go into a second round of questions. There are a few things I want to get asked on the record. First off, for Ms. Krause, Congresswoman Holmes Norton asked a question earlier about the assumptions that GAO used to come up with its 2023-2024 timeframe for return to travel. Could you, for the record, discuss those assumptions now?
That's based on a number of forecasts that we've seen. And that is really, when you talk about 2023, 2024, that's to get to the pre-pandemic levels of 2019. A lot of that's driven by, certainly there's been some promising trends when it comes to domestic travel and some of those leisure markets. But the big driver, as other members of other panelists have discussed, is really on the international travel and business travel and when that's coming back. And there's a number of factors that play into that. different nations' public health responses and increasing public confidence in terms of in making those types of trips.
Thank you. Mr. Callio, a question for you. There was a report that CEOs of several U.S. air carriers recently met with Gina McCarthy, the head of the National Climate Task Force, and other key administration officials to discuss your industry's efforts to combat climate change. We had some questions earlier about that issue, but what priorities do you think that A4A members, carriers, share with the current administration on reducing emissions in the aviation sector? When I ask about priorities, I don't necessarily mean goals. I guess I'm focused more on the actions that you would share. Mr. Callio?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a sustainability and climate as a very, very significant priority we have for many years. We've made great progress over the last 30 years, but we realize there is more progress to be made. You know, what's interesting is that we have our board meeting actually this week, our March board meeting. Last year in March, March 2nd or 3rd, we had a half-day retreat with all of our board present and spent the entire afternoon talking about our position on climate change and what more we could do. Within a couple of days, the results of that retreat didn't go out the window, certainly, because our members have continued to work, as have we, but survival became a priority. We are refocused. We have, like I said, our board meeting this week. A very significant amount of time is going to be set. We did have that meeting last week. We thought it was a good meeting. Everybody is on the same page. And as we told the administration, we want to be part of the solution and we want to work with them.
Just to follow up on that, the EU has set some pretty aggressive goals on sustainability and in aviation. Would you consider, would your industry consider those efforts in Europe a challenge, a threat, or folly, or something in between?
I'm having a little bit of difficulty spooling up exactly what they have done, Mr. Chairman. So if I may, can I get back to you on that? Europe has been very aggressive, and I'm going to be really candid. In many ways, they don't value air travel perhaps as much as we do because of the distances between countries. So they have often pushed forward without consultation with the industry. And I think whatever you put in place ought to be something that you think can work and can be achievable.
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Boland, just on this theme of sustainability and thinking about future recovery, you touched on this in your comments as well as your written comments, but the role that advanced air mobility plays in addressing issues of congestion and so on. Could you expand on that a little bit and why that's important to you all as a NBAA? Mr. Boland.
Well, certainly mobility, that ability to get people and products where they need to be, when they need to be there, is fundamental to our nation's transportation system and fundamental to our economy. I think there's a lot of excitement about the vehicles that utilize electric propulsion, hybrid propulsion, and perhaps hydrogen propulsion. I think the opportunities there require us to look at our infrastructure, which is a very strong airport infrastructure with over 5,000 public use airports in the United States, but recognize that we want those airports to be available to accommodate future uses. And that includes air mobility aircraft, but it also includes ultra long range aircraft flying halfway around the world, consistently doing so in a more sustainable way and perhaps even at supersonic speeds in the future. So there's a lot of technology coming to the market. I think we have an infrastructure we can build on, but we want to make sure that we're building an infrastructure for the future.
Thank you very much. I'll just ask if there's another member on the GOP side available. Currently no. Okay. Then I'm going to recognize for 5 minutes Representative Kai Kalehe from Hawaii. Representative Kalehe, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair, and I really appreciate, Chair, you holding this committee today. My question is for Captain DePete, and it expands on Captain DePete's testimony and also previous questions from other members that I don't want to repeat again. And it touches on the payroll support program. You know, because of the efforts of this committee and you know, the previous Congress and what they've done for the industry, we have avoided, you know, mass furloughs and mass layoffs of the aviation industry, and specifically members of ALPA and the almost 60,000 pilots that work for our U.S. domestic carriers. Now, many of those pilots have been able to keep their jobs and continue to receive their paychecks and their health care benefits for them and their families, and avoid extended leaves of absence or you know, times when they wouldn't be able to fly because they've been granted a leave from the company. And obviously from Mr. DePete's testimony, he talked about how difficult it is to bring a pilot back, to get them requalified, to get their security clearances, their badging, their currency, to get them flying again. And so the best thing we can do is continue to keep them with the company and on the payroll. But what ends up happening is PSP allows airlines to do that. But for the last, let's say, 9 to almost 12 months, many of those pilots who've continued to stay on the payroll haven't been able to fly. A small percentage of them have continued to fly, but many of them have not continued to fly and have either maintained basic currency in a simulator or through their annual recurrency training requirements. So my question is, what can we do to ensure that pilots that are on the books, continuing to be employed, but are unable to fly because we're just not flying airplanes, how can we as a Congress work with the industry to keep these pilots current and, more importantly, proficient? We know consistency is key to flying. You can't just get in a plane, you know, after not having flown for a period of time and not to lose some of those, you know, specific skills and training that we have. And so my question is for Captain DePete, what can we do for those pilots and the thousands of them across the country who are not flying and are slowly losing some of those critical skills and technical skills that they have in the cockpit?
Thank you, Representative Kahile, and it's great to see you in the seat. Congratulations again. Great question. You know, we hear from our pilots all the time about this, and ALPA is, as you know, actively involved in working with our carriers, because obviously the training houses right now are pretty full as we deal with the reshuffling as a result of some of the departures that some of the early outs that were taken. But we believe that, you know, as pilots, you know, we're probably our own worst critics, right? We always want to stay at the top of our game. There's no substitute for the minimum of 2 well-trained, experienced, well-rested pilots out there. But you're right, there's a lot of pilots who reach their own personal limit to say, you know what, I need to get back in the simulator again, or I need to go out on a line maybe with a line check airman again. And we've been working through our training council. We have a training council that actually has input from all our 34 airlines. And we're working with our carriers to ensure that any pilot who wants to do more in terms of just not more than just the normal check rides that we get, but wants to do more for proficiency, has access to be able to do that. So that's one of the areas, and we'd like to support for that.
Great. Yeah, you know, like you said, Captain DePete, sometimes, you know, those 3 takeoff and landings every 90 days just doesn't cut it. And if we can get in the simulator more, or we can get a little bit more training, you know, that'll help. The most important thing for all of our airlines and America's aviation infrastructure, and that's safety.
Gentleman yields back.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So with that, I think that's a great way to end this hearing on COVID-19's effects on U.S. aviation and the flight path to recovery. I want to thank the panelists today, just for the sheer numbers of members who were interested in participating. Shows that we have a keen interest on ensuring continued support for aviation and aerospace industry recovery. The recovery is multifaceted. It is likely to occur faster in some areas of aviation and aerospace industry than in others, which means that we'll need to continue to pay very close attention to the industry and to the women and men, importantly, who work in that industry. As well, we were able to discuss some of the future of aviation and what might be some of the next steps that we'll need to take to be supportive of continuing job growth in this industry, and likely to be a subject of a future hearing as well. So with that, no further questions from members. Seeing none, I want to thank the witnesses again for your testimony. Your comments have been informative. They've been very helpful. And I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may have been submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. And with that, the subcommittee now stands adjourned.